Section 27 of Poland, A Study of the Land, People and Literature, by George Brandis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Piotr Nater. Brodziński, the pioneer of Romanticism. Popular ballads. The Ukrainian poets Malczewski, Zaleski, Goszczyński. The new literature had a forerunner who bore the same relation to it as did Herder to the German intellectual revolution and Stephens to the Danish, Kazimierz Brodziński, a man of a gentle, genial nature, born in 1791 in a country town in Galicia, who lost his mother early and who, badly treated by his stepmother, took refuge in the servants' hall and in the cottages of the peasants. He thus became early familiar with the way of living and manner of thought of the common people, and also with the national fairy tales, traditions, and ballads. In other respects his education was German. As in 1809 a part of Galicia had been united to the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Brodziński entered the Polish army and took part in Napoleon's Russian campaign of 1812. In 1813 he was taken prisoner at the Battle of Leipzig. Some years later he settled in Warsaw, where in and after 1822 he delivered admirable lectures at the university on Polish literature, Shakespeare, Goethe and Schiller, etc., and directed the attention of his hearers to the value and quickening influence of popular national poetry. Most of the members of the Ukrainian school of poets, as well as Mickiewicz, received an impulse from him. He had a rival who, in the eyes of his contemporaries, far eclipsed him, Osiński, also professor of the history of literature in the university, the favorite of society, a fanatical champion of the classical taste, a blind condemner of the rising romantic poetry, and a brilliant speaker. Brodziński's voice was not strong, and his appearance was simple, but his eloquence was genuine, and his influence on young men very great. Slightly under the influence of Goethe's Hermann and Dorothea, he wrote the idyll Wiesław, a quiet love story, enacted among the peasants of Krakow, which is read to this day. With proud humility he called himself the modest village sexton, whose only service has been that he awakened literature to its morning devotions before daybreak. As a teacher he prized naturalness above everything, naturalness in manners, in style, in poetry. He turned the minds of the young generation from classical localities, the regions of Arcadia, and exhorted its poets to sing of their own beautiful land, the soil on which thy youth was passed, for which the sons of Sarmatia have poured out their blood, and where thou shalt sometime lay down thy white head, while the firs grow green over thy grave. As an aesthete, Brodziński cannot be called a scientific man. He was less and more. Less, in so far as he lacked methodical skill. More, because what is called science in this domain may exist without originality, without judgment, without the least perception of individuality, while genuine literary production in its billowy life, in the lot and part which the personality, its mood and its art have in it, excludes direct scientific treatment. In him arose an author who belonged at once to life and to the world of books. He stood halfway between science and art, and above science in the fields where mere science is no art. The revolution of 1831 tore him away from his peaceful labours and threw him into a vortex of national fanaticism which had hitherto been foreign to his being. Like so many others, even of the greatest, he became convinced of the messianic mission of his fatherland and lost himself in prophecies. In an essay on the nationality of the Poles, he wrote this sentence: "The Polish nation is the Copernicus of the moral world. It has discovered the law of the attraction of all races to the central moral point, the idea of humanity. It was granted to this nation to bring the rights of the throne and of the people into equilibrium, on scales the beam of which stood fast in heaven itself." So strongly did the recent and apparently final defeat of Poland affect the clearest and purest intelligences. Popular ballads gave the first inspiration to this brood of poets, for this was the form most remote from the classical. All the Slav nations and the Lithuanians, a race allied to the Poles, possessed national ballads in great abundance, but of very unequal merit. The best is certainly the Lithuanian ballad, Daino, in which a race far different from the Slavs has incorporated everything poetical which it had at heart. Servia's rich popular poetry, now known over the whole of Europe by translations and adaptations, had an influence on Runeberg in the north. That of Poland is less plastic, softer and milder, sometimes also lighter and gayer. Finally, the poetry of the steppes, and the boldness and melancholy of its inhabitants, live in the South Russian ballad, the Duma of the Cossacks. While yet a child, Mickiewicz learned the Polish popular ballads from an old servant. They are known in Denmark only by 2 or 3 paraphrases in Hauch's Polish family. Among these is a long one, which begins: "Why, O birch tree, dost thou stand so solitary on the heath in the winter and wind?" This little song is a paraphrase, in Shakespearean style, of an ancient unrhymed popular ballad of the 15th or 16th century. Birch tree, beautiful birch tree, why art thou so sad? Does the old white frost make thy sap stiffen, or is it the wicked wind which blows upon thee? Or is it the brook which washes the earth from thy tender roots? Sister Olga, says the birch, the old white frost and the wind do not hurt me, neither does the brook. But from afar, far distant lands came the Tartars, and they broke my boughs, and they kindled great fires, and trod down the grass, the beautiful green grass, round about me. And where they built the fire, there the grass will never grow any more, and where they rode through the crops, they look like the autumn stubble. And where their horses waded through the brooks, no beast will drink, and where their arrows strike, the wound heals only in the grave. Even before the greatest poet of Poland was inspired by the Polish national ballads, the group of poets, which was directly influenced by Brodziński, pointed out the way to Mickiewicz, studied the Cossack Duma, and lost themselves in the broad horizons of the steppes. This group formed the so-called Polish-Ukrainian school of poetry, whose 3 greatest names are Malczewski, Zaleski, and Goszczyński. Antoni Malczewski, born in 1793 in Volhynia, died when only 33 years old, unappreciated, nay, unknown. He is the author of the most popular poem in Polish literature, and perhaps the one most frequently republished and illustrated, Maria, an Ukrainian tale, in style recalling Byron's early shorter epics. Malczewski was the son of a Polish general, received the French culture of the fashionable world, entered the army under Napoleon, was severely wounded, resigned his position as an officer, travelled in foreign countries from 1816 to 1821, took part in the amusements and pleasures of the society of the upper classes till he lost his fortune and health, when he returned to Volhynia, settled in the country, and was drawn into an intrigue with his cousin, the invalid wife of a neighbouring landed proprietor, whom he restored to health by a magnetic cure. She left her husband, and the 2 lived together for some years in Warsaw, where Malczewski, who was now very poor, supported himself by a private appointment, until the uneasiness and importunity of his companion (she could not endure him to be away from home) compelled him to resign his position. Although very neurotic himself, and harassed by the exactions of an excessively neurotic woman, he forced himself to the culminating work of his life. Maria appeared in 1825, was unfavourably judged by stupid critics, attracted no attention, and did not sell. Malczewski died under the impression of this failure, and when his death was announced in the newspapers of the classicists, Osinski gave him these parting words: "He is said to have tried his hand at Polish poetry." The important event in Malczewski's literary life was that he became personally acquainted with Byron in Venice. Byron was then 30 years old, Malczewski 24, both very fine-looking men. They belonged to the same rank in society, were both melancholy and sensual, but the former had a martial, the latter a sensitive and delicate nature. It was natural that Malczewski should fall under the influence of the great Englishman. In return he, it is said, gave Byron the idea of his poem Mazeppa. The model of the hero of Maria was Felix Potocki, who appears frequently in Polish literature, one of the fated chieftains of the Confederation of Targowice. He is here idealized into a handsome and blameless knight under the name of Wacław. As he had married a young lady of the petty nobility against his father's will, the cruel and artful father, after a pretended reconciliation, sent him and his father-in-law away on an expedition against Crimean brigands, and then caused his bride to be drowned by masked men in the moat of the castle. By placing this event in the times of the Tartar contests, the poet has enabled himself to treat it in such a way as to give himself the opportunity of playing on all the strings and using all the powers of which he was master. He described the freedom, wildness, and silence of the steppes of Ukraine, when he sang of the solitary Cossack who rode over the steppes to carry the voivode's false message of reconciliation, dwelt lyrically on the character of the Cossack, freeborn, yet so faithful to his lord, gave with force and precision the picture of the sortie of the Polish knightly band, with the ring of the trumpets and the clatter of the horses' hoofs under the Gothic portals, and painted, in contrast, the portrait of the solitary Maria, the ideal of the gentle, devoted Polish woman, the consolation and pride of her father, who, when near him, lives for him, but who ever and always is thinking of her beloved, her husband, consumed by a longing for him, the world of her soul, whom, in the poem, she only sees for a few hours again before she bids him an eternal farewell. The conversations between the lovers are reproduced with sentimental enthusiasm. The battle between the Poles and the Tartars is depicted with great impetuosity. The fundamental traits of the two different races of men stand out sharply, and we are sensible of the significance of the conflict between civilization and barbarism in those times, when the campaigns of the Poles were directed against perpetrators of violence of the most cruel kind, and their self-defence became the bulwark of Europe. And in the next place the poet has drawn a skilful contrast between the uproar of the masked men at home and the fury of the battlefield, the former concerned with the murder of a defenceless woman, and the latter taking place to protect that home which was being destroyed at the same moment. The murder of the young woman is not described at all. We see that the author shrank from it. Hardly anything is made of Wacław's meeting with the corpse, although his longing for the living woman on the ride home is very strongly emphasized. Where his imaginative power failed him, the poet understood how to conceal the want by setting the reader's fancy in action, while he opens up possibilities, suggests a great deal, leaves a great deal undetermined. Malczewski, in his treatment of this theme of his native country, was influenced, as we cannot fail to note, by reminiscences of his travels. When he opens the second canto, like the first, with a description of the steppes, he draws a parallel between their natural characteristics and those of the beauties of nature in Italy, and declares that the depressed man who would be cured of his melancholy must hie to the south, since the melancholy uniformity of the steppes only lays bare the wounds of the heart. When the masked men are about to enter into the castle with a song, the author is also full of Italian reminiscences. The carnival at Venice was before his eyes with its gaiety, as a contrast to this horrible mummery, and he has mingled the tones of a dirge with the gay song of the masqueraders, much as Victor Hugo would have done. Partly in memory of his association with Byron and his influence, partly as an expression of something Polish and personal, Malczewski introduces a mysterious page who is present when the preparations are made for the murder, and who later meets Wacław and jumps upon his horse behind him, when he rides away for revenge. Of him the poet sings: "Who was he, the young man with the tearful look? Angel or devil? Was it the spirit of his misfortune? Will he add to the pangs of Wacław? Share his sorrow? I know not. He embraces him, and they disappear at a gallop." Elsewhere this young page says of himself, "I am a foreigner in my native land. My fate has left black scars on my breast. That I, so young, was compelled to eat the poisoned bread of the world, it is that which has burdened my heart and set my tears flowing. When I sing a song, the melody is sad." It is plain that in a naive and awkward manner the author here introduced his own personality into the poem, which was to survive him and make him famous after his death. To the Ukrainian group of poets, in addition to a series of minor intellects, Padura, who became a wandering ballad singer, and Grabowski, who wrote Ukrainian melodies, belong the two Zaleski and Goszczyński, both greatly influenced by Brodziński's lectures, with their references to the nature of their own country. Bogdan Zaleski, born in 1802, who, after a silence of more than a generation, died 2 or 3 years ago in Paris, is not, like Malczewski, the poet of the Polish nobility, but of the Cossacks. Again and again he has praised, in verse, his beloved steppes, his Dnieperland, and in fact he has sung of nothing else. He himself says that for him the carol of the birds, the ditties of the young girls, and the songs of the men in praise of the ataman flowed together into a single living song, which he drank in a full draught. Mildly and elegically he sings the longing for the steppes, the yearning for the scenery of the Ukraine, the dangerous life and the solitary death that are the lot of the Cossack. Placable and gentle, he passes over the time when Poland harassed and oppressed the Cossacks, who rose in continual conflicts against his native land, and goes back to the peaceful times of the 16th century, which again he purges of everything grotesque and brutal. His best known poem, The Holy Family, a somewhat bloodless Christian idyll, which treats of the time after the Passover in Jerusalem when Christ was a child, describes the uneasiness of the parents until he was found teaching in the temple, and paints with delicate colours the tone within and without this temple, is mainly valuable for the picture of the pilgrim's journey to and from Jerusalem in the fragrant spring, the bivouacs under the open heavens, with the frugal supper obtained from the country village, and the shouts of the children around the campfire, a picture which is an exact reproduction of what he had seen on the steppes of his native land, when the South Russian pilgrims went on pilgrimages to their holy places at Easter, only that there is not the boldness in the description which the subject demands, but the blunt mildness of miniature painting. After the revolt of 1831 was ended, Zaleski emigrated, and soon after, like other greater poets, became in Paris a votary of Towiański's fanaticism. Later he turned back from mysticism to orthodox Roman Catholicism and wrote a long, shallow poem in the ascetic spirit. Seweryn Goszczyński, born in 1803, died in 1876, came from a village in the department of Kiev, was educated as a comrade of Padura, Grabowski, and Zaleski, as a young man was mixed up in a conspiracy, took part in the revolt in 1830, and afterwards emigrated to Paris, but later came back to Austrian Poland. His chief work, The Castle in Kaniów, 1828, which treats of a sanguinary revolt of the peasants of the last half of the 18th century, is a poem rich in romantic horrors, represented with an undaunted eye and a firm hand. Goszczyński was a gloomy, superstitious, martial being, with great dramatic gifts, who dwells by preference on outbursts of violent passion, scenes of murder, madness, and fire. While Byron's spleen and melancholy gave Malczewski courage to give expression to cognate traits, it was Byron's taste for wildness and violence which appealed to Goszczyński. His soul vibrated at the recollection of the war of extermination waged against each other by the Polish nobility and the Cossacks. He dwells on the hot desire and cold cruelty of the men, and the ungovernable love of the women, leading them to madness or murder in order to free themselves, and he loses himself, without trembling, in visions of the massacres of that time, of punishments such as impalement, and the red glare of burning castles. End of section 27. Section 28 of Poland, A Study of the Land, People and Literature, by George Brandis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Piotr Nater. Mickiewicz and Goethe, Paris and the Ode to Youth, Youth of Mickiewicz, Mickiewicz and Pushkin. One day in August 1829, two young Poles arrived at Weimar, in order, if possible, to make the acquaintance of the great Goethe. They had letters of introduction to his daughter-in-law, Madame Ottilie, whose maiden name was Pogwish, and to him also, from a Polish artist of high standing, the court pianist Madame Szymanowska of St. Petersburg. They were well received, and were remarkably popular, not only in Goethe's house, but also in all the best society of Weimar, and they well deserved it, for they belonged to those persons who amply repay the hospitality shown to them. They were Adam Mickiewicz, at that time 30 years of age, and his 26-year-old friend Odyniec, the most enthusiastic and amiable Patroclus any Achilles could desire. Odyniec's natural and graceful letters from Weimar show us, as in a mirror, what the widely celebrated little city was in the days when Goethe had reached his 80th year, and, in addition, describe, with a delicate gift of observation, even if not without partiality, the contrast between the two greatest poets of Germany and of Poland, when one was an old man and the other in all the vigour of his youth. We hear the old and the young master talk, and their utterances deal with the life of the moment. The description of the first visit to Goethe is delightful, when they were admitted, after having waited for a while, with frightful beatings of the heart. We actually hear the accents of Goethe's enthusiastic exclamation concerning Madame Szymanowska: "Elle est charmante, comme elle est belle et gracieuse, comme elle est charmante," and later the little party at the house of Madame Ottilie, when young Odyniec was so fascinated by the charming Madame Vogel. Goethe asks him the good-natured question, "Wie gefallen denn Ihnen unsere Damen?" And the young Pole, not yet entirely perfect in the German language, answers smiling, "Paradiesischen Vogel, Exzellenz," meaning to say, "Paradiesvogel." Note: "Well, what do you think of our ladies?" "Paradisical birds, your Excellence," for birds of paradise. The play on the name Vogel, bird, is lost in translation. End of note. One day, when Odyniec had taken breakfast with the Vogels, and remained so long that he missed the dinner hour at the hotel, on his return he found Adam at the table from which the cloth had been removed, with two French gentlemen. They wanted him to help them to the name of Poland's greatest poet, but he constantly mentioned names which they rejected as wrong. One of them said, "Non, non, c'est non pas le nom, Mick, qui est donc votre grand poète?" Mickiewicz looked significantly at Odyniec and nodded his head gently, then proposed the name of Krasiński, and, during the indignation of the Frenchmen at the ignorance of the Poles of their own literature, Adam rose and went to his room. The gentleman, the elder of whom was the celebrated sculptor David d'Angers, who had come to Weimar to make a bust of Goethe, now turned to Odyniec, asking if he did not know the name of Poland's greatest poet. "Probably you mean Adam Mickiewicz," he replied. When David broke out, Exactly, it is of him that I wished to speak," he received the answer, "It is he who just went out of the door." "Oh, how droll! But it is so. I have his picture in a Spanish cloak." It was the well-known portrait of Mickiewicz leaning against the rock of Ayuda. David immediately seeks Mickiewicz in his room and finds this changeable being, who was just now gloomy and indifferent, genial and gay. During the lively conversation, according to the enthusiastic description of Odyniec, Adam suddenly grows to a giant and shoots forth sparks like a volcan, so that David, wholly carried away, begs permission to execute his portrait as a medallion. On a succeeding day he persuades the poet to read aloud to him something of his own in a French prose translation. Mickiewicz reads the poem, which is certainly the best of his short poems, Faris. The strongest part of it is as follows. How happy is the Arab when he lets his horse leap out into the desert from a block of stone. The horse's feet sink into the sand with a dull sound as when the glowing, red-hot steel is plunged into the water. So he swims away in the golden sea of sand, and parts the dry waves with his breast. Faster, even faster. Already his hoofs hardly touch the plain of sand. Farther, farther. He has already vanished in a cloud of dust. He is black, my steed, like a thunder cloud. A star shines on his forehead. He spreads his withers like an ostrich wing before the wind, and his white hoofs flash lightning. Fly, fly, my brave horse with the white hoofs. You forests, you mountains, place, place. The cliffs, the watchmen of the boundaries of the desert, turn their dark faces toward me, repeat the echo of my gallop, and seem to threaten me. It is as if they shouted, "Whither does this madman go?" There where he is hastening, there are neither any palms with their green crowns, nor any tent with its white breast for shelter against the arrows of the sun. There sleep only the mountains, there only the stars pursue their course. I hasten, hasten. When I turn my head, I see the shame-faced cliffs, flying and hiding one behind the other. But a vulture has heard their threats. It is stupid enough to believe that it can make me its prey here in the desert, and it swings down through the air towards me. 3 times it sighs around my head, and encompasses me as with a black crown. "I scent," it croaks, "the smell of death. O mad knight, O mad horse, does the knight seek a path here? Here lies only death, here only vultures fly." He shrieked and threatened me with his shining claws. 3 times we measured each other with our eyes. Which of us quailed first? The vulture. I hasten, and when I turn my head I see the vulture far, far away, like a black spot on the heavens, at first as large as a sparrow, then as a butterfly, then as a gnat, and then it vanishes in the blue of the heavens. Fly, fly, my brave horse with the white hoofs, ye cliffs, ye vultures, place, place. Then I let my eyes run round the circle of sight, as if I were the sun himself, and I saw no one all around me. Here sleeping nature has never been wakened by man. Here the elements rest peacefully, just as beasts on a newly discovered island do not fear the sight of man. But Allah! I am not the first, not the only one here. Are they travellers or robbers who are lying in wait? How white they are, the horsemen, and their horses are also hideously white. I fly towards them, they do not move. I shout, they answer not. Allah! It is death. A caravan long since buried in the sand, from which the storm has now blown the sand away. On the bony sides of the camels sit skeletons of Arabian men. Through the holes where eyes once sat, the sand flows out and seems to mumble a threat. The madman! Why does he ride hither? He will soon meet the hurricane. I hasten, I fly. O death, hurricanes, place, place. But the hurricane comes, the most fearful of Africa's disturbers of peace, which moves solitary over the sea of sand. It seems to me to be far away. It is surprised. It stops. It whirls around me as if saying to itself, "What younger brother of mine among the winds is this, which, so feeble in growth and so slow in flight, ventures into my old kingdom of the deserts?" It roars and comes towards me like a pyramid in motion. But when it sees that I am only a man, and do not step aside, it stamps raging on the ground and leaps over half of Arabia. It seizes me as a kite does a sparrow. It strikes me with its whirling wings, burns me with its flaming breath, hurls me up into the air, and throws me down on the earth. I jump up and fight against it, tear apart the gigantic knots of its whirls. I bite it, crush with my teeth whatever I can get hold of in its body of sand. It would like to slip out of my arms, but it cannot tear itself loose, and it grows weak. Its head falls back, dissolved in a shower of dust, and its immense corpse stretches itself out at my feet, like the rampart before a city. Then I took breath, lifted up my eyes, and looked proudly on the stars, and all the stars looked steadily down on me with their eyes of gold, for they did not see anything but me in the desert. Oh, how sweet it is to breathe here, to breathe in and out, in full draught of a full heart. I breathe freely, fully, deeply. All the air of Arabia is hardly enough air for my lungs. Oh, how sweet it is to look around as far as the eye can reach. My eyes are enlarged, strengthened, their gaze already pierces through the circle of vision. Oh, how sweet it is to stretch one's arms out freely, peacefully, to their full length. I feel as if I could embrace the whole world from east to west. My thoughts fly like an arrow, higher, higher, higher up yet into the abyss of the heavens. And as the bee entombs his life with the sting with which it pierces, so I hurl and pierce with my thought my whole soul into the vault of heavens. David gave a bound in the chair on which he was sitting, modelling his medallion with a bit of wood which he had splintered from a stick which lay behind the stove. "How did you hit on that?" he asked. "I like that," answered Mickiewicz. "There you see the artist who wants to know the conditions under which the work came into existence and had to come." And he related that while still very young he had read some Oriental poems in a French translation, and how one day in St. Petersburg, as he was leaving a gay dinner party and saw that a storm was coming up, he had taken a droshky and said to the driver that he must hurry. And the driver let the horse go as fast as the reins and harness would allow, and this chasing and rattling, the soughing of the blast, the rolling of the thunder, and more than all this, his delight in the rapid movement, awakened the melody of Faris in his mind, and the poem was completed the same night. This poem is admirable not only for its grand fantasy, but for its vigorous youthful force. There is in it a pride, a self-assurance, which the poet's first readers needed. It encouraged them not to succumb. There is no Goethe-like self-limitation here, none of Schiller's sense of the distance between the ideal and the reality. It is the apotheosis of endless temerity, and it is indeed quite in the same spirit as the celebrated Ode to Youth, which Mickiewicz completed soon after. This ode has been called his first political poem, although in itself it is entirely unpolitical, but, without any intention on the part of the author, it became the Marseillaise of the Polish youth. He who as a boy has already killed serpents will as a youth be able to strangle centaurs, wrest from hell its spoils, and win laurels in heaven. Mount so high that no eye can follow. Break and demolish what intellect alone does not break. Youth, thy flight is the flight of the eagle, and thy arm leads the lightning. Let us place ourselves arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, and surround the world with a chain, collect our thoughts to a single flame, and all our souls to a single hearthstone. And thus, old world, out of thy tracks, we will thrust thee, old earth, out into new paths, and peel off thy decayed shell, that the spring of thy youth may blossom on thee. Reading this lyric, we understand Odynietz's joyful outburst about his friend when he says that in the conversation with Goethe, Adam's words were glowing metal, Goethe's bright cold coins. But we also understand the amazement of the conventionally educated young Pole at Goethe's whole manner of thinking and feeling. It is especially when the conversation in Goethe's house turns on the natural sciences that both the Poles have occasion to wonder at Goethe's purely pagan contemplation, while they themselves are all fire and flame, devotion and faith. Goethe at times expresses one simple and weighty thought after the other. Odyniec quotes some expressions taken directly from the lips of the old man. La nature a le trait et la charme de l'infini. We must be consistent in our investigation, and nature deceives no one. Nature's treasures are enchanted. No spade but a word discloses them to the eye. I have often been at war with nature, but I have always ended by asking her to forgive me," and many other similar sentences. He writes home to a friend in Poland thus: "If you are already astonished that here the talk is only of nature, what will you say if I tell you that this term recurred at least 200 times, and the word God was not mentioned once? As if nature were one and all, Alpha and Omega, its own creator and deity. This is then the pantheism which I have hitherto, God be praised, only known by report, and which I believed was only proclaimed by people who spoke against their own better convictions, and did not understand what they themselves said. But today it was otherwise. Everything that Goethe said, and even everything which he did not say plainly, was clear. And this clearness, this winterlight chilled me with such coldness, that even the radiant glances of my beautiful companion at the table, Madame Vogel, only struck on my heart like the rays of the sun on snow which it cannot melt. I looked inquiringly over to Adam, in order to guess his thoughts, but he sat gloomy and silent. And Odyniec rejoices that his great friend still believes, as he says in Dziady, that there was someone who hung the weights in the clock of the world, and that the Polish prophet thus distinguishes himself from the German Titans. For him Goethe is the wise man who does not know the living truth, sees no miracle. And he applies to himself, with reference to Goethe, the words of Mickiewicz's poem Romanticism: "Emotion and faith speak more strongly to me than the eye and the telescope of the sage." And then follows a criticism of Faust, dismay at the creed that God is only an emotion which man draws from nature, and every name a mere sound. What is this Faust? Satire? Irony? Insult? And against what is it directed? He asks. Against German scholasticism, or the everlasting moral laws and truths, emotions and ideas, traditions and aims of all humanity. He asks Mickiewicz for counsel, and we see that the latter is content with excusing Goethe. We must always recognize that he never takes the offensive against religion, as the authors of the last century did, but is only indifferent to the fundamental religious truths. Consequently not 18, but 20 less 2, bursts out Odyniec. So foreign was Goethe's views of life to Mickiewicz. The nature of the latter shines out in its Polish individuality when we place him by the side of the greatest poetical genius of Germany. He was born in 1798 in the little village of Zaosie near Nowogródek in Lithuania, a descendant of an old noble family. In the spring of 1812, when he was 13 years old, he saw the armies of Napoleon march through Poland on the campaign against Russia, Poland's white eagle united with the golden eagle of the empire. The King of Westphalia had his headquarters in Mickiewicz's ancestral home at Nowogródek. The hopeful and martial spirit of the times filled the child's soul and fertilized that of the man. He says in Pantadeusz, "O spring, to have seen thee in our home that great year, thou memorable spring of war, thou spring of fertility, O spring, to have seen thee with flowers in masses, with the green of the fields and woods, and the pomp of warriors in battle array, rich in miracles and achievements, and with 1,000 hopes in thy lap, memory great and fair, thou fillest me even today. Born and bred in thraldom, as a child an exile in chains, I have never in my life known but one such spring." In 1815 Mickiewicz came to the University of Vilna, began to study philology, and formed an intimate friendship with the afterwards well-known Thomas Zahn, the soul of the private society of the Philomatians and of the public society of the Philaretans, both of which recall the German Tugendbund, non-political associations having the intellectual and moral development of the students as their aim, which were, however, soon to be overtaken by the suspicion and persecuting fury of the Russian authorities. After having made his first essays in composition in a purely classical style, like Oehlenschläger and Victor Hugo, Mickiewicz turned to the new European Romanticism. Here, as in England, it was Bürger's Lenore which called forth a new ballad poetry. Itself evoked by Old English ballads, the poem had so strong an influence on Walter Scott that he made his debut with a translation of it. A version by the Russian poet Zhukovsky made so deep an impression on Mickiewicz that he adopted an entirely new style and composed a whole series of ballads, one of which, called The Flight, even treats of the same theme as Lenore. These poems, which are founded upon local popular traditions or Slav superstitions, are now romantic in the tone of popular ballads, now vigorously dramatic, like the admirable Song of the Voivode, immoral as a poem in prose by Mérimée, or again humorous, like the descriptions of the terror of the devil at the Termagant in Madame Twardowska. Mickiewicz had had a first unhappy love, as it was called, a passion on which the poets of that time, Byron, Heine, and many others, lived poetically for a long time. He had already fallen in love in Novogródek with a young girl of good family, Maria Vereszczaka, celebrated in his verse by the name of Marylka, who preferred another to him. In the condition of erotic desperation, which he was now experiencing, Byron became his only reading, and he wrote the oldest parts of Dziady, the Festival of the Dead, which, in connection with an old Lithuanian custom of placing food and drink in the churchyards for the dead on All Souls' Day, the 2nd of November, introduces peasants, shepherds, an exorcist, and a great number of spirits on an imaginary stage. Among these spirits is a suicide, the victim of unhappy love. In other fragments this suicide, called Gustavus, after the hero in Madame de Kruidener's sentimental romance Valérie, appears as a ghost, who is condemned every year on the 2nd of November to suffer his agony of mind again. All these fragments, full of romantic ghosts and overstrained emotions, are without interest to the foreign reader. Werther and Werther's offspring appear on the scene again. Immediately after, however, came the little heroic poem Grażyna, which treats in fresh verse an old Lithuanian motive of patriotism and female bravery, and in this there was nothing obscure or mawkish. The form is clear and the intellectual impulse vigorous. After 2 or 3 years' residence in Kovno as a teacher, Mickiewicz returned to Vilna, where events soon revolutionized the calm life he had hitherto led. The murder of Kotzebue by Sand had helped on the reaction in Germany. It was awakened at the same time in the great neighbouring land. Alexander's liberal tendencies came to an end with the year 1823. The authorities began to hunt out attempts at rebellion on the part of the students. Novosiltsov, who had fallen into disgrace after having squandered in excesses what he had scraped together in all sorts of ways, set himself to discover a conspiracy in Poland, and went, with his whole staff of spies, to Lithuania. All the monasteries in Vilna, 8 in number, besides several other public buildings, were made into prisons. At the end of October 1823, Mickiewicz, Zahn, and all their friends were arrested. The young men were confined in cells, but could see each other in the evening in the cloisters. How long they were there they did not rightly know. They had no almanac and received no letters. There were wooden shutters on the windows, so that it was difficult to distinguish the morning from the evening. Thomas Zahn, who took upon himself all the blame of the innocent meetings of the Philomatians and Philaretans, was treated the most severely and suffered especially from hunger. He was sent to Orenburg and was not pardoned until 1837. The long exile changed his views of life. He, who had been a freethinker and an oppositionist, entered the service of the Russian state as a mystic and ascetic. After 10 months of detention, Mickiewicz was sent to St. Petersburg, and when he was assigned to service in one of the governments of the interior, he chose Odessa. When he came thither, there was no vacancy for a teacher. Then, in company with the subsequently celebrated Rzewuski, who tried his hand at authorship at the request of Mickiewicz, he made a journey to the Crimea, and in his case, as with many others of the best Slav poets, the first view of the mountain landscape and the southern scenery sharpened his appreciation of nature. What the Caucasus was to be for Pushkin, Lermontov, and Tolstoy, that the grand panorama of the Crimea was for Mickiewicz. His Crimean sonnets have justly been given a chief place among his poems. In Moscow, where he obtained a post in the office of the Governor-General, he wrote Wallenrod, as well as Grażyna, taking his subjects from the pagan days of Lithuania and the contest of its princes with the Teutonic Knights. The hero, historically a Grand Master of the Order, who, himself ruined, brought the whole order to ruin, was made a Lithuanian by Mickiewicz. In order to withstand the national enemy more effectually, he insinuates himself into the enemy's camp, pretends to be of his party, becomes a leader of his army, and thus, with one blow, avenges his countrymen. It is a glorification of dissimulation and treachery in the service of the fatherland, a Machiavellian idea incarnated in a Byronic hero. Interwoven with this fundamental theme there is a sentimental love story in the romantic style. The censor who read the poem without understanding it allowed it to be printed, and this, in conjunction with the Crimean sonnets, soon caused the name of Mickiewicz to be in everybody's mouth. The best Russian society was opened to him, not only in Moscow, but in St. Petersburg, whither he speedily received permission to travel. It was the Princess Zenaida Volkonskaya who introduced the poet to the Russian aristocracy, where he became a favorite and was greatly loved and admired. Many ladies took lessons of him in Polish, and the Princess Volkonskaya became his translator. The sonnets and Wallenrod were now read as zealously in Russia as in Poland, and the author, somewhat enervated by the amusements of society life and the favour of the ladies, for a long time only wrote trifles. He had a great desire to see foreign countries, and it was the influence of the Princess Volkonskaya which obtained him a passport for an indefinite time. With this he left St. Petersburg in May to see the wide world by way of Weimar. We have seen him in personal contact with the greatest poetical mind of Germany. A year before he sought out Goethe, he had entered into personal relations of friendship with the most eminent Russian authors of that period. Mickiewicz and Pushkin were of the same age. They came to occupy parallel positions, each at the head of one of the two great Slav literatures. Both commenced as disciples of Byron. Both, with advancing years, became more and more national. A fundamental difference between them lies in the fact that Pushkin, after the controversial and rebellious attitude of his early youth towards absolute power, allowed himself to be won over by the personal goodwill of the Tsar Nicholas, and lost all faith in the ideals of his youth, while Mickiewicz, to his death, continued faithful to his first political enthusiasms and hopes. The memory of their intercourse is preserved in Pushkin's poem The Bronze Horseman, and in the fourth part of Mickiewicz's poem St. Petersburg, which bears the subtitle The Monument of Peter the Great. Mickiewicz has here preserved the impression of a conversation which the poets, one day in 1829, the very year before the fates of Russia and Poland were divided, had in St. Petersburg, during a shower, both covered by Mickiewicz's cloak, at the foot of Falconet's celebrated monument to the Tsar. The verses are as follows. One afternoon 2 young men stood hand in hand, seeking shelter from the rain under the same cloak. One of them was a pilgrim who had come from the west, an unknown victim to the power of the Tsar. The other was the poet of the Russian people, celebrated through the whole north for his songs. They were not old acquaintances, though they knew each other well, and a few days before had become friends. Their souls, which had raised themselves high above the barriers of the earthly life, resembled 2 twin mountain peaks in the Alps, which, separated by a furious mountain torrent, are hardly sensible of the roar of the force which separates them, and bend their lofty peaks toward each other. The pilgrim stood lost in deep thought, when the Russian poet, in a low voice, said to him, "To the first Tsar who created this magnificent city,
the second Czarina raised this memorial. Note: the inscription is Pietro Primo, Catarina Secunda. End of note. The Tsar, already cast in bronze, of heroic size, sat on the bank of his Bucephalus, and waited till a place should be prepared for him and his horse. But there was not ground enough for him to stand on in the land of his birth, so they sent a messenger over the sea for a pedestal for him, and from Finland's rocky shore a huge granite block was torn away, and, at the bidding of the Czarina, swam over the waves, sprang on shore, rolled on, until, in the great city, it cast itself down at its ruler's feet. There it lay firmly, and then the bronze Tsar dashed forward, the autocratic Tsar in his Roman toga. He spurred his horse so that with a leap he mounted on the granite block, steadied himself on the edge, and reared up in the air. Not thus in old Rome does Marcus Aurelius, that favourite of the people, sit on his horse, he who first made his name famous by driving out spies and accusers, then, after having punished the tormentors at home, chastised the highwaymen on the Rhine, and the barbarians on the Pactolus, and peacefully returned to the Capitoline. Beautiful, noble, and gentle is his brow, from which one idea shines, that of the welfare of the kingdom. He raises his right hand majestically, as if to give his blessing to the whole host of his subjects. The other hand rests on the reins, and restrains the ardour of his steed. But the Tsar Peter gives his horse the reins. We see that he has ridden everything down in his way. Now he has sprung up on the upper side of the rock. The foreleg of the horse already plays in the air. The Tsar does not hold him back. He pulls at the bit. He must fall and be crushed. It has already stood thus for a century without falling. Thus a waterfall issues from a mountain, is caught by the frost, and stiffens into ice, hanging over an abyss. Yet when the sun of freedom rises, and a breath from the west warms these frost-bound regions, what will then become of the waterfall, and of tyranny? As various internal signs show, the words are really the words of Mickiewicz, not of the Russian poet, into whose mouth he has put them. Pushkin, for his part, afterwards wrote a poem about this meeting in St. Petersburg, which was not printed till 4 years after his death in 1841, and which, since at that time it was impossible to mention Mickiewicz's name in Russia, merely bears the superscription to M. In it is the following passage: "He was our guest. Among a race which was foreign to him, he cherished no hatred to us, and on our side we loved him. Gentle and as a friend he sat at our table, we exchanged with him pure dreams and poems. He was inspired by heaven and looked down upon life as if from above. He often spoke about the days of a great future, when the nations should forget their dissensions and be united in a single great family. We listened eagerly to his prophecies. Then he passed on to the west, and our blessings followed him on the way. But now our peaceful guest has become our enemy. To flatter the fierce multitude who listen to him, he sings the praise of hatred in his verses. His voice comes to us from afar. O God, give peace to his embittered heart." There is no shadow of any personal ill-humour in this utterance, in which Mickiewicz's later position is judged from a Russian point of view. A still warmer sympathy inspired the article which Mickiewicz published in the French newspaper Le Globe on receipt of the news of Pushkin's death. In spite of all the attraction towards each other which they experienced at a certain period of their lives, and in spite of their common descent from Byron, they were, and continued to be, contrasts, in so far as Pushkin in his whole being was an aristocrat, a poet for the few, a scorner of the many, while Mickiewicz, on the other hand, was a spirit wholly given up to his nation. For Pushkin, to be national meant reconciliation with the authorities, a rupture with trust in freedom and in the future of Europe. On the other hand, Mickiewicz became national only by emancipation from all connection with official Russia, and by an optimistic enthusiasm, which stands in the sharpest contrast to Pushkin's constantly increasing satiety. In his later productions, Pushkin constantly complains that the dreams of his youth have left him, dreams of love, of freedom, of honor, and he exclaims, "I see no goal before me." The strength of Mickiewicz as a productive genius was that he was not for a moment in doubt as to his aim. Pushkin was Russian, as Mickiewicz was Polish, but as Michelet has somewhere expressed it, if I'm not mistaken, at that time Russia was not yet a nation, only an administration and a whip. The administration was the German, and the whip the Cossack. But while Russia was a government without a nation, Poland had a comparatively better lot of being a nation without a government. End of section 28.
Section 29 of Poland, A Study of the Land, People, and Literature, by George Brandis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Piotr Nater. The political situation determines the manner of treating all subjects, the point of view for love and hate, maternal and filial emotions, the relation between the individual and the people, between genius and the surrounding world, between emotion and reason, relation to religion and philosophy. As soon as we have observed how the three factors, national character, Romanticism, and the political situation, determine, develop, exalt, humble, or stamp the nature of these poets as men, we easily discover how these same motive powers invariably determine their productions. But since Romanticism is the same in all countries, and the national character manifests itself quite differently in different times, for instance quite otherwise now than at that time, it appears that the political situation is the important factor. It determines the point of view from which the life of man is beheld, the point of view for all the spiritual problems which are treated, the character of the masculine and feminine leading persons, and the entire symbolic and allegorical form of the poems. The study of Polish literature leaves no doubt that it is the poetico-political dream life which modifies the spiritual condition and the spiritual questions that are contemporaneously treated in European poetry, because it brings them within the national angle of vision, wholly excludes some questions, and brings forward certain new ones, which are not treated in any other place. For instance, let us consider the subjects on which the poetry of Goethe and Heine, Byron and Shelley, Hugo and Musset turns, and see what form and shape they assume here. Such subjects are the whole domain of love and hate, the description of all the passions in their conflict and battle with duties, the question of the power of the human spirit to penetrate and understand the universe, of the justification and future of religious faith, of the relative right of the different ranks in the war of classes, of the right of genius and its meaning for its nation and for humanity, the different views of life of two generations succeeding each other, etc. Take an emotion like love between a man and a woman, and see how it is treated by a Polish poet of that period. In the narrative and dramatic works it often has a wild and criminal, but never a sensual character. But when the poets either express themselves in their own name or through heroes, behind whose masks we catch a glimpse of their traits, it is amazing how abstract and incorporeal love becomes in their hands. It is always emotion, never desire. It is in unison with this that the sorrow of love, and there is more of the sorrow of love than of its joy in their poetry, is forced into the background and overcome by other less personal emotions, like political enthusiasm or patriotism. In Mickiewicz's Dziady, the hero, under the impression of such a revulsion of feeling, even gives himself a new name. He designates the day on which he was imprisoned, which corresponds with the day on which the author was imprisoned, as the day of the death of his old ego, as his new birthday, drops his peaceful name, Gustavus, and assumes the new martial one, Conrad. Gustavus obiit 1823 calendis Novembris, hic natus est Conradus, etc.
That is, the name of the hero of Byron's Corsair replaced that of Madame of de Krudener's emotional romance. The incident is typical. There is generally a Gustavus who dies in order that a Conrad may arise. And it is also in harmony with this that the Polish women in poetry are so unearthly. We can never imagine them engaged in the daily work of life. They are either heroines, who, high on horseback, rush into the tumult of the battle, or they are ethereal phantoms, visions from a better world, angelic manifestations, whose being is pure soul. There are in one of Wordsworth's poems these well-known lines about a young woman whom he admires. A creature not too bright or good, for human nature's daily food, for transient sorrows, simple wiles, praise, blame, love, kisses, tears and smiles, a being breathing thoughtful breath, a traveller betwixt life and death, the reason firm, the temperate will, endurance, foresight, strength and skill. Such an earthly and simple ideal of woman, as it may be called, is never found here, because the national keynote and the secret political thought of the poets demand to see her either in the guise of a patriotic Amazon, or as the personification of the national genius. Thus woman is greatly admired, much glorified, but little observed or studied here. Neither as a sweetheart, nor as a daughter, nor as a sister, nor as a mother does she stand out purely as a human being with strongly individualized qualities. The picture immediately becomes ideal and is always kept within the definitions of a species. Love is generally described without any shadows. Filial affection is often exalted, as in Słowacki's Lilla Veneda, by all the cruel sufferings which a hostile prince makes the father endure, and the mother appears as one whose emotions are hardened early, and whose vocation consists in accustoming the son to bear with firmness whatever hard fate life may have in store for him. This is the note of Mickiewicz's celebrated poem To the Polish Mother. Take thy son in time into a solitary cave, teach him to sleep on rushes, to breathe the damp and vitiated air, and to share his couch with poisonous vermin. There he will learn to make his wrath subterranean, his thought unfathomable, and quietly to poison his words, and give his being the humble aspect of the serpent. Our Redeemer, as a child, played in Nazareth with the cross on which he saved the world. O Polish mother, in thy place I would give to thy son the toys of his future to play with. Give him early chains on his hands, accustom him to push the convict's dirty wheelbarrow, so that he shall not grow pale before the executioner's axe, nor blush at the sight of the halter. For he will not go on a crusade to Jerusalem, like the olden knights, and plant his banner in the conquered city, nor will he, like the soldier of the tricolor, be able to plough the field of freedom and water it with his blood. No, an unknown spy will accuse him. He must defend himself before a perjured court. His battlefield will be a dungeon underground, and an all-powerful enemy his judge. The blasted wood of the gallows will be the monument on his grave. A few women's tears soon dried, and the long talks of his countrymen in the night time will be his sole honor and memorial after death. The masculine leading characters in these poems, like romantic heroes in general, are nationalists, and moreover passionate and martial natures. But there are traits which distinguish them among all others. In the north, in those days, our poets went to antiquity to find heroes. The most celebrated of them, the heroes of Oehlenschläger, are types of the most vigorous youth of those times, light-hearted, eager for battle, fond of travelling, in the main good-natured, not without transitory relations with mermaids and terrestrial women. Tegner's Frithjof is something of the same kind in Swedish, a knight whose relation to the political events of his time is extremely weak, almost nil. They do not in any respect resemble the heroes of the contemporary Polish literature. These are all much more weird and all pursue politics. If, for instance, we compare Tegner's Axel with Mickiewicz's Grażyna, two poems whose whole form is borrowed from the poetic narratives of Byron, and which further have this in common, that in both a woman fights in the dress of a man, then the difference is especially this, that in Tegner's poem everything is wanting which, even if ever so feebly, could sound like an exhortation or warning to the poet's contemporaries. On the other hand, in Mickiewicz, whose scene is laid in pagan Lithuania, the action is as follows. Prince Litavor, dissatisfied with his father-in-law Witold, called on the Teutonic Knights to help. His wife Grażyna, who has not been able to keep him from this defection, arbitrarily commands that the German messenger shall be denied access to Novogródek. And when the wrathful allies direct their campaign against Litavor instead of against Witold, Grażyna puts on her husband's armor, passes herself off for him, and goes to battle against the Germans. Although the victory falls to the Lithuanians, thanks to Litavor who hastens to the spot at the right time, the princess herself is mortally wounded by a shot from a German gun. Her slayer is thrown upon the funeral pyre with her body, and Litavor casts himself into the flames. The lesson which the author seems to wish to teach to his countrymen is therefore this: a wife, in spite of her husband and prince's command, may dare to send away allies, deceive the army, expose the country to danger, carry on war, lose the battle, provided only that she has the national honor in view. Everything is allowed when the highest object is at stake. Or let us take another group of leading masculine characters which have their origin in Byron's heroes, the young men of Alfred de Musset. One and all they are placed in this dilemma. The possibility of distinguishing themselves by achievements, now that the Napoleonic era is over, seems to be closed to them. They accordingly throw themselves into debaucheries, and in a life which excites and stupefies the senses, but weakens the energy, they become more or less unfit for political, artistic, or martial action. This internal contest between the inclination to amusements and the impulse to action never appears in the Polish poets. Here the conflict is always between the inclination to action on a large scale and some kind of obstacle which lies before the individual, and which he is not in a position to get out of the way. Just as little as in Victor Hugo are the heroes here young representatives of the new stratum of society, which, as if inspired by a recollection of the French Revolution, rises in bitter contest against the higher classes. The hero here is never a democrat from principle, to say nothing of a republican. In social aspects the whole of this poetry has a conservative stamp. Even Słowacki, who passes for the poet of the future, is no serious exception. The only work in which class contests play an important role, Krasiński's Godless Comedy, is so far from showing the advocate of democracy in a heroic light that he even appears as a figure of a Caliban-like roughness, who is not even fully certain of his rights and convictions. And finally, if we compare the leading characters in the Polish poets with those of Byron's own poetic youthful narratives, which had such an extraordinary influence upon the Polish poets, we find that there is indeed a certain resemblance in the violence of mind, and the wild and melancholy despair. Their life is a chain of sufferings, disappointments, passions, crimes, and imprecations, but they never have the trait which passed from Byron's own nature into that of Childe Harold and Lara, of despising their own countrymen, their own country. When they become traitors to it, or fight against it, like Litavor, like Wallenrod, it is in a transitory fit of passion, which is immediately repented of, or the treachery is feigned for a short time only with the intention, when it comes to the point, of serving it the more energetically. Nay, even when, like Słowacki's fantastic king, they subject the nation to sufferings and torments without number, it is only from a kind of higher love, which under the mask of cruelty is the motive power of their method of treatment. They would harden the nation as the smith hardens the metal on his anvil. They would by harshness force the nation up to a continually higher plane of development. And the poet's intention is never, like Byron's, to nettle or rebuke a circle of readers, but to arouse a nation, to teach it that a national existence is not too dearly bought by a torture of a whole generation. In order to arouse his nation, he would beat on the heavens as on a brazen shield. The schism between the great individual and the nation, which is so characteristic of the life and poetry of Shelley and Byron, never manifests itself here. This is, indeed, partly because the poets never exalted themselves so high above the average intellectual condition of their people, its religious and political daily life, as Shelley, for instance, but also quite as much because of their feeling of homogeneity with the people whose only organs they were. And as they felt themselves one with the people, so also they saw the people collectively. This is the reason why they never tried to describe the opposition between two successive generations, a theme which generally supplies such a fruitful material for poetry, and which Kraszewski afterwards made his own. Mickiewicz, indeed, glanced at the subject as a theme of the past in his dramatic fragment written only in French, Jacques Jasiński ou les deux Polonies. In Pantadeusz he makes the imitation on foreign customs and the praising of foreign countries the subject of mild derision. He contrasts therewith the love of the beautiful natural scenery and old usages of his native country, but he never desired to use as a subject any contrast between the methods of thought of two generations. And on the feeling of the indissoluble connection of these poets with their people depends also the existing conception of poetic genius. In those times they never conceived of the poet in Poland as an artist, but as a seer. That poetry is above all an art, according to some the first of all arts, that its function is the representation of the life of nature and of man in a perfect and irreproachable, and therefore imperishable form, was seldom suggested. If, by exception, one of these poets undertook such a peaceful and comprehensive reproduction, as did Mickiewicz in Pantadeusz, he personally valued this work of his very little, and did not even understand its exceptional worth. They conceived of poetry above all as inspiration, as a divine frenzy, which discloses itself in hallucination and improvisation, and as a fact these poets were almost all eminent improvisators and subject to illusions. In a certain sense it can therefore be said that Konrad's improvisation in Dziady, which gives an intensified conception of Mickiewicz's own improvisation, marks the apogee of the romantic poetry of Poland. There is only one among their poets, Krasiński, who is alive to the dangers of the nervous exaltation which resulted from this ideal. In his melodrama, The Godless Comedy, he pointed out vigorously the weakness of character which was its bane. The poet is regarded by the others as the chosen leader of the people, not myriad-minded in a general sense, as Shakespeare calls the poet, but exclusively representing the millions of men who make up his people. In this sense we must take what Konrad says of himself: I am called Million, for I love and suffer for millions of men. The greatness and beauty of this interpretation of genius depend on its narrowness. Genius here is intensified patriotism, which is thought to make the man inspired and far-seeing, and which, by putting in his mouth the words which charm, secures his ascendancy over other minds. In the improvisation, Konrad says, My love does not rest on a single being like the insect on a rose, nor on a family, nor on a century. I love the whole nation. I have embraced all its past and coming generations, pressed them to my heart as a friend, a lover, a bridegroom, a father. I would give my fatherland life and happiness, make it admired by all the nations of the earth, if I could. But the power for that is wanting to me, and I stand here armed with all the might of my thought, and also with that power which men do not give, the feeling which burns within me as in a crater, and sometimes breaks out in words. I was born a creator. I have my powers from the same source as thou, God, hast thine. Is it thou who hast given me my mighty penetrating gaze, or did I myself take it there where thou didst take thine? In the moments of my full strength, when I lift my eyes towards the driving clouds or the sailing bird of passage, then I only need to will, and with a glance I bring them to a standstill, catch them as in a net. Only men, corrupt, frail, even if immortal, serve and know me not. But I will lead them, not with weapons, for one weapon protects from another, but by feeling which is in me. Let men be for me as the thoughts and words with which, when I will, I construct poems. It is said that it is thus that thou rulest. I would have power. Give it to me, or show me the way to it. My soul is incarnated in my native land, and in my body I have all the soul of my native land. My country and I are one only. I look on my unhappy country with the same eyes with which a son sees his father broken on a wheel. I feel the pangs of a whole nation, as a mother feels in herself those of her child. This is not the careless northern conception of men of genius as the elect of fortune, who, by a miracle, easily find what inquirers seek for in vain. But Conrad is just as far removed from the brooding heroes, the Manfreds or Fausts, with whom George Sand in her time compared him. For the joys and sorrows of a life of thought are far from occupying the prominent place in the poetry of Poland which they hold in that of Germany or England. The slow and toilsome struggle of human thought for freedom, for strength, to cast aside the cerements of prejudice, its attempt to penetrate the secrets of the universe, which is elsewhere described with confidence in thought as the guiding power, and with faith in its final victory, all this appears here only as foolhardy exertion, or an outburst of tragic despair. For to all these poets the answer which religion gives is the final answer. They sometimes doubt, they never reject. Even when they lose faith in some dogma of Catholicism, even when they make attacks upon the Church and its priests, or show sacred things in a comic light, they do not dissociate themselves from the Christian conception of the world. Thus we saw from Odyniec's letter during his residence in Weimar those admirable descriptions of the intercourse between men of genius and talent and beautiful women that, however great an admiration the author cherished for Goethe as artist and scientist, he understood nothing whatever of his philosophy of life, and even if Mickiewicz understood this better, it is clear that he did not feel a greater attraction to it. Odyniec's reflections on Faust are as feminine as those of Madame de Staël in her Germany, and Mickiewicz was not able to see anything in Goethe's nature worship and natural piety but avowed indifference to revealed religion. Krasiński also expresses himself wholly in the same spirit when, in the preface to Dawn, he says that the phlegmatico-delirious atheism of German philosophy has resulted in chaos, and when, in the bold anticipatory attempt to give a positive system of fundamental definitions and laws of the universe, he only sees the negation of a revelation. The Polish poets did not share the rationalistic belief of the greatest of Germans, because they vaguely felt that with this belief no firm immovable bounds were prescribed to the human understanding, and that, as a necessary complement, it circumscribed the possibilities of and the capacity for action. They wanted a belief in the energy of youthful enthusiasm as it appears in the Ode to Youth, a belief in miracles of courage and achievement which presupposes belief in miracles as a link in the government of the world, and therefore necessarily regarded reason as a quality of very great limitations. Since they wished to have a right to demand the improbable, the impossible of youth, they had necessarily to secure for themselves an enclosure for the supernatural in space as well as in time. Finally, they felt strongly, with regard to Goethe, that the religion they needed was not a religion of contemplation like his, but a religion of action and suffering. Goethe's pantheism, therefore, could not compensate for their inherited circle of ideas, which incited to deeds and surrounded torments with glory. Nor could the otherwise predominant influence of Byron's poetry disintegrate this circle of ideas. They encountered in him no opposite convictions, only doubts and questions. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that Shelley in his lifetime had received the recognition he only obtained half a century after his death. Then the Polish poets would have found in him the combination which nowhere met them: Goethe's lofty and sure conception of nature, in combination with the practical enthusiasm, the strong hope, and the belief in the miracles of activity, which they themselves required, and which to their sorrow they missed in the old man at Weimar. For Shelley was eternally young, and, like them, appealed to the youth of the mind. If they had come under his influence instead of Byron's, the cause of intellectual freedom in Poland would have a less difficult battle to fight now. Without wounding the religious feelings of their readers, they would have been able to transform them so far that the inevitable schism in the future between the ideas of this century and the emotional life of the nation would have been less deep. It is especially in Conrad's great monologue in Dziady that Mickiewicz has tried his power of formulating a theory of the universe. The enormous extent of human suffering has brought Conrad to doubt the existence of God. From the first he feels himself as strong as a god. The poets in those times liked to regard themselves as gods. This is the confusion of ideas which appears in all countries when Romanticism culminates. The poet who, in imagination, can stop the flight of the birds and the course of the stars, can, it is argued, really do so, since in this fantasy of his he has a divine power. For, according to the Romantic teaching, imagination is the decisive quality, that which God and man have in common. The creative power of the divinity is imagination. And it is in this feeling of his supposed power over nature that Conrad asks of space if there is a higher power than his own. Show thyself, and let me be sensible of thy superiority. He cannot solve the contradiction that divinity is a quiet spectator of the sufferings of life on earth. I suffer, I rage, and contented and secure thou rulest continually, judgest continually, and it is said that thou art never wrong. Listen to me, if it be true, that which I learned even in my cradle, and have believed in with childish faith, if it be true that thou lovest the world because thou didst create it, if a heart which feels is not a freak of nature, which is produced by accident and dies before it comes to maturity, if in thy kingdom emotion is not an illegal thing, if millions of unhappy beings who call for help are anything else in thine eyes than an equation which it is difficult to solve, then thou art silent. I have unveiled thy inmost being. With a voice which will resound from generation to generation, I cry out into the universe, to the utmost borders of creation, that thou art not the world's father, but, the voice of the devil, its Tsar. We see that the poet has taken care that the reader should not confound his own way of thinking with that of the hero, for it is the devil who here prompts Conrad, and the irritation under which he speaks is imparted to him by invisible demons who fill the air about him. Thus, but even more distinctly, Krasiński, when in the Godless Comedy he gives expression to doubts, which he himself had perhaps felt at times, puts them on the lips of distracted men and women. The strongest outburst of doubt which appears in Krasiński's works is uttered in a madhouse. The sick countess says, "Christ can no longer save us. He has seized his cross with both hands and thrown it down into the abyss. Do you hear this cross, which has been the hope of millions, rebounding in its fall from star to star? It breaks, it is splintered, and with its dust it obscures the universe." So we also see that the only one of the poets who really believed in philosophy, the brave lyrist Stephen Garczyński, the war poet of the Revolution of 1831, the favorite and imitator of Mickiewicz, the writer who, as the disciple of Hegel, seems personally to have separated himself most widely from the church creed, in his principal work Wacław makes his hero, it is true, attack monks and priests with harsh and angry words, but still in such a way as to leave religion undisturbed by the assault. He blames the monks because they destroy the capacity for thought and action by their teaching, but he himself believes and prays. It is in the name, not of reason, but of emotion, that he declares himself to have outgrown ecclesiastical forms. Garczyński's hope or wish as man and poet was to bring his world of emotion into harmony with his reason, to reconcile the kingdom of the heart with that of the mind. The fourth canto of his Wacław, entitled Science, shows that, unlike the German teacher, whose disciple he was, he did not see salvation and the highest life in thought and its development in science. The reaction from theory to practice, the enthusiasm which leads from contemplation to action, seemed to him to comprise the complete truth of human life. According to his conception, only in the contest for practical ideals does the opposition between emotion and reason cease to be a strife, and the personal preference of the poet, as it appears from the poem and as was to be expected, lay not on the side of rational understanding, but on that of enthusiasm. Finally, we note the same trait in Słowacki, even when, in Beniowski, he makes his great and passionate onslaught upon the Jesuits. Here he goes so far as to prefer a fatherland without a future to a fatherland under the guardianship of the Jesuits. He overwhelms Rome, nay, even the Pope, with taunts, but he is so far from calling Christianity itself in question that he cries to Poland, "The cross that is thy Pope." No outburst could be more significant of the emotional life of those days. In the revolt of 1831, the Polish priest, crucifix in hand, marched at the head of the troops, and was, in reality, the power which attached the common people to the cause of independence. But this Catholicism was not that of Rome, for when, in the same year, languishing Poland, praying for help, stretched out her hands to the Pope, he referred the Poles to the Tsar, demanded obedience and submission, and stamped the rising as rebellion. Again, there was no opposition from the Pope when, in 1833, the forced conversion of the united communities who had joined the Catholic Church took place. Dragonades of Cossacks were employed on the Russian side. They surrounded the villages and knouted the priests. Then the Russian Pope, with his whip in his hand, held a review of his new parishioners, and in military colonies the stubborn were put to death as rebellious soldiers. It was officially stated on the Russian side, as regards this amalgamation of the united congregations with the Greek Church, that it was to be looked upon as a happy union which had cost no tears. Only gentleness and persuasion have been used. And the Pope, the one sovereign whose duty it was to do his utmost for Poland, looked on without protest. We can understand how Słowacki, in 1841, could at once express his aversion for the Pope and his confidence in Church and Cross. Nevertheless, it is very suggestive that, at least until the last, when he was enthralled by Towiański, he was sceptical and wavering in his faith. The preface to Lambro, with its attack upon the poets of the religious school and its keen sense of the false and artificial in the theories of Friedrich Schlegel, is a proof of this. Neither is it without significance that in the tragedy of his youth, Mendog, as well as in his poem The Monk, the conversion from paganism or Mahomedanism to Christianity, whether from calculation or belief, is represented as bringing misfortune, calling forth the execration and hatred of the nearest relatives. In any case, this is especially peculiar to Polish Romanticism, that the political defection resulting from the abandonment of the old customs of the nation or the community is described as so unpardonable that no rising to a more lofty religious conception of life can atone therefor.
End of section 29. Section 30 of Poland, A Study of the Land, People and Literature, by George Brandis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Piotr Nater. The two principal themes of the leading poets, Mickiewicz, Słowacki and Krasiński. The first two, the poets of vengeance. Krasiński, the poet of love. Among the Romantic poets of Poland there are three whose names are written in letters of fire: Adam Mickiewicz, Juliusz Słowacki, Zygmunt Krasiński. If we glance over the collected works of these three great Romanticists, we shall find them dwelling especially on two themes. They depict horrors and they sing of hope. In other words, a double current flows through the Polish poetry of the years 1820 to 1850. It describes sufferings which lead to thoughts of revenge, and sufferings which tend to produce spiritual development and purification. And whereas in other respects we must generally put Mickiewicz by himself on one side, Słowacki and Krasiński as two united friends on the other, here it is Mickiewicz and Słowacki who come nearest each other in spirit, who willingly and frequently occupy themselves with thoughts of vengeance, while Krasiński stands opposed to them as the advocate of universal brotherhood. The inclination to that which is tragical and heartrending is common to all the poets. They either hasten towards a bloody catastrophe, like Mickiewicz in Grażyna, Słowacki in Hugo, or the whole poem is taken up with scenes of destruction. Juliusz Słowacki, born in 1809 at Krzemieniec, the son of a professor of the history of literature, lost his father while he was a little child, but through his whole life maintained the tenderest and most confidential relations with his mother, who was soon married a second time to the Professor Beku of Vilna, who was assailed in Mickiewicz's Dziady. Spoiled by the daughters of his stepfather, loved by his mother, the boy grew up in a life of fancy, which resulted in an exclusively poetic bias and an all-absorbing artistic ambition, which became the stimulus and spur of his life. He became the typical romanticist, who took it for granted that a romantic life was the true condition for the production of genuine poetry, and who never wasted time or thoughts on giving his planless career a material foundation of work or effort. All deference to the useful was hateful to him. His strong imagination was, in its essence, not so much creative as musical, picturesque, and decorative. In fact, his talent was a great gift of language. He impresses by the melody of his verse and his wealth of imagery. He was educated at the University of Vilna, which at that time could offer no further nourishment to his mind. It was already laid waste by reaction. As compensation, he imbibed the exalted patriotism of the period and all the ecstatic sentiments of the romantic frame of mind. Byron laid hold upon him as upon many other poets, and nowhere did the English poet come upon a better prepared or more congenial spirit. Byron's way of thought and Byron's desperate characters became almost immediately his own. He, too, as a youth, experienced an unhappy love for a young girl, a daughter of Andreas Śniadecki, a cultured maiden a good deal older than himself, who would not listen to the story of his flame, and on this account he suffered his first infernal pangs of wounded pride. His stepfather died. Słowacki in 1829 entered the office of the Polish Ministry of Finance in Warsaw as clerk, when the revolt broke out, and so took possession of him that he wrote several lyrical poems in the revolutionary spirit. It seems that his enthusiasm was speedily cooled, and in the year 1831 we find him suddenly leaving Poland, under circumstances which made it impossible that he should ever return. He travelled to foreign countries with a passport from the revolutionary government. At Dresden he was commissioned to carry dispatches to London, and journeyed from London to Paris, where in the following year he printed his first volume of poems, containing dramas and narratives in the Byronic style. Mickiewicz also soon came to Paris. He was already widely celebrated, and Słowacki, a beginner, consumed with an unsatisfied ambition, full of self-esteem and thirst for recognition, regarded his great rival with mingled feelings. His first poems did not cause any great sensation, yet some lovers of Polish literature, after reading his drama Mary Stuart, recognized in him certain qualities lacking in Mickiewicz. Half in doubt, and half inclined to overestimate himself, he burned to hear the opinion of Mickiewicz. In the preface to the third volume of his poems he wrote, "Neither encouraged by praise,
nor disheartened by criticism, I throw this third volume down into the silent abyss which has swallowed the first two. His pride prevented him from seeking Mickiewicz, but common friends brought them together, and then followed a reciprocal exchange of civilities and compliments. Soon after, Słowacki became a member of the Polish Literary Society, of which Mickiewicz was president. Their pleasant relations were nevertheless soon disturbed. Acquaintances carried to Słowacki Mickiewicz's dictum that his poetry resembled a wonderful temple, but that there was no God in it. And to Słowacki everything about Mickiewicz soon became disgusting, from his crumpled shirt to his papistry. He even denied that Mickiewicz had any poetic ability. Then the third part of Dziady appeared, in which the author rises higher than ever before, but in which, unfortunately, Słowacki's stepfather Beku, whose memory was dear to him and precious to his mother, was represented as Nowosiltsov's lickspittle, struck by lightning as a punishment for his baseness. From this time forth Słowacki hated Mickiewicz. He even thought of challenging him. "O mother," he writes, "there is nothing left for me but to encompass thee with such an effulgence of honours that the arrows of others cannot strike thee. God has inspired me. It will be an equal fight with Adam." In the first, as in the later poems which he publishes, his poetry shows a basis of agony, a frame of mind apparently induced by a vision of annihilation. Naturally, with him, as with other poets, his mood depends mainly upon the harmony which exists between an artist and his public. Wherever such a sombre seriousness has mastered all minds as that which fell upon the Poles after the unsuccessful revolution, a poet simply to be heard, in order not to be pushed aside as a buffoon who misunderstands the common temper, must necessarily in his art reflect suffering, discontent, wrath at terrestrial or celestial injustice, and depict numberless unsuccessful attempts to prevent wrong, or at least to avenge outraged right. He does it because generally he is subject to the same influences as his people, receiving all impressions far more keenly and sympathetically. This disposition appears in its most abstract form in such works as Słowacki's The Plague in the Desert, which is justly celebrated as a tragic description of a calamity recalling that of Niobe. In 1835 Słowacki made a journey from Paris to Italy by way of Marseille, later a journey from Naples to the east, which took him to Greece, Egypt, Nubia, Syria, and from which, in 1837, he returned to Italy by way of Cyprus. On the way to Syria, at El Arish, he was compelled to lie in quarantine in the middle of the desert. To this sojourn was due the poem of the plague-stricken family of El Arish, in which an Arab tells in simple, eloquent words how he has seen his 4 sons, 3 daughters, and his wife torn away from him by the plague, one after the other. This narrative, which, in contrast to several others by the author, has not a line too many, but is characterized by an antique severity and biblical grandeur, has obtained such high recognition, not only because of its artistic excellence, but because of its harmony with the melancholy of its readers. More than one found the picture of his own trials and losses in the poem. With a vague feeling that there was a certain bond, a certain point of union between the subject and the reader, commentators have endeavoured to give a symbolical explanation of the episode, seeing allusions to the loss of their fatherland and their grief thereat, only to be arrived at by the most far-fetched interpretations. The truth is that without any symbolism whatever, the reader might well see, in the family visited by the plague, a group of beings whose fate was akin to his own. Słowacki's Arab is a poem of the same character. It depicts the abstract mania for annihilation, the satanic desire to spread death and destruction and destroy the joy of life, wherever it is found. The being who from an ambush shot the arrows of the plague against the unfortunate Arab father and his children might be supposed to have such thoughts. Nevertheless, there is more here than the mere poetry of suffering. The poetry of cruelty is combined with it, a theme which recurs again and again. Słowacki especially revels in the description of horrible cruelty. It came near home, for these poets had experienced great cruelty in their lives, and fancy is receptive above all things. It gives out the pictures with which it has been filled, the cruelties with which all Słowacki's dramas, and most of the narratives swarm, betray how deep an impression the tortures he experienced in his life, or had heard or read about, made upon his mind. Several of the fiercest traits of cruelty in his poems are founded on actual historical incidents. Ivan the Terrible, like the leading character in Król Duch, on one occasion nailed the foot of a messenger to the ground with his sword without diverting him from the delivery of his message, just as happened with the old bard in the poem. And the prototype of many such traits in Słowacki must be sought for in contemporary events which made his blood boil and inflamed his fancy. All the poets dwell insistently on prison scenes, scenes of banishment and harsh punishments. Descriptions of sufferings, long speeches that narrate and describe cruelties, take up nearly the whole of the third part of Mickiewicz's Dziady,
in which the author has delved so deeply into his own personal experiences
and fearlessly brought upon the stage contemporaries under their real names. He has never elsewhere achieved such scorching realism of effect. And strangely enough, he thought that this was genuine Romanticism. In his poem Romanticism, he began by rejecting dead truths. If you would see wonders full of the truth of life, he says, have a heart and look into hearts. Shortly after he defined the essence of Romanticism thus: when the Romanticists write, they have the naked truth before them, while the Classicists are content with the marionettes. Here he proclaims distinctly the right of the poet to seek the naked truth in his nearest environment, however lowly and simple it may seem to be. Finally, he upholds the same doctrine distinctly in this poem, in which, after the manner of Dante, he praises and condemns his contemporaries without respect of persons. The poet describes how a young gentleman relates the story of Mickiewicz in a drawing-room in Warsaw. He, one of the handsomest, gayest, and most spirited young men of Poland, recently married and happy, disappeared one day from his home. It was said that he had committed suicide. No one understood why. The police caused it to be rumoured that his cloak had been found by the Vistula. Years passed by. One gloomy and rainy evening some prisoners were brought from the Carmelite monastery to the Belvedere. An intrepid young man in the crowd of spectators shouted out, "Prisoners, who are you?" And among 100 names the name of Mickiewicz was shouted back in answer. His wife was informed, and she sent petition after petition to the government, but could learn nothing. Reports floated about Warsaw during the 3 following years, during which no news of him was received, that he was being tortured, but that he would confess nothing, that he was kept awake at nights, that for whole months he had salt herring to eat without any water to drink, that he was given opium to frighten him with visions and spectres, that he was tickled under his arms and on the soles of his feet, and more, until his name was forgotten among the names of the other persons who had disappeared. Then, one night, there was a ringing at the door of his wife's house. Outside stood an officer, a gendarme, and a prisoner whom they delivered, demanding a receipt. They threatened him with uplifted finger, "If you dare to talk," and went away. He was changed, had become stout, but with the unhealthy fat of the prisoner. The wrinkles of half a century were on his forehead. He did not seem to recognize his old friends who came to greet him, but looked at them with an absent gaze. All that he had suffered in the days when he was tortured, and all that he had thought in the nights when he lay awake, was revealed by his eye in a second. This eye was frightful to look at. It was like the panes of the grated windows of a prison, the colour of which is greyish like a spider's web, but which, seen from the side, has rainbow reflections, and in which we discern a bloody rust, mirrored lights, and dark spots. They have lost their transparency, but their surface betrays that they have long been exposed to dampness, neglect, dust, and darkness. When he was asked a question, imagining himself still in prison, he replied, "I know nothing. I know nothing." A young lady, the feminine providence of the emigrants, Claudia Potocka, asks, "Why do you not treat such subjects in your poems?" A count answers, "Old Niemcewicz may use them in his memoirs." A man of letters exclaims, "That is a frightful story." Another, "Tragic, on my word." A third finally says, "We listen to such things, but who would read them? It is outrageous to bring eyewitnesses upon the stage instead of mythical persons. And then, besides, there is an inviolable and holy rule of art. It is that poets must not treat of an incident till... A young man, how many years are we to wait till a fresh fact has become as dry as tobacco and as honey sweet as a fig? The first, there is no fixed rules. The second, 1,000 or 2,000 years. Besides, you could not say in a poem that he was fed on salt herring. An impression may be obtained from this quotation of the force and clearness with which sufferings are depicted here. Or read Sobolewski's comment on the 20 kibitkas, sleighs, full of young students and schoolboys of Samogitian, which he saw drive away to Siberia to the beating of drums, while the crowd stood like a wall before the prison behind guards with fixed bayonets. Every feature here is full of life. Take, for example, these lines. "Poor children, you all have shaved heads like recruits and fetters on your feet. The youngest, who was only 10 years old, complained he could not lift his chains, and showed his bare and bleeding feet. The police officer asked what he complained of, and, being a humane person, himself examined his chains. 10 pounds, this is according to the regulation," he said. Then Janczewski was brought out. Torture had made ugly, thin, and dark him who a year ago had been the gayest and handsomest of them all. He looked down from his kibitka like the Tsar from his pedestal of rock. His glance was proud, dry, clear. He seemed to wish to console his comrades, and his smile seemed to say to the assembled multitude, "See how little misfortune touches me." He noticed that people wept when they beheld his chains, so he lifted them up in the air and shook them to show that they were not too heavy for him. The kibitka set off at a gallop. He waved his hat, crying, "No, it is not all over with Poland yet." And the crowd hid him from my sight, but for a long time his arm could still be seen, raised up against the heavens as a background, and the tattered black felt hat waving like a banner of woe above the smoothly shaven young head, the proud and spotless head which from afar bore witness to the innocence of the victim and the shame of the executioners. Just as color has its compliments, and the chord of the seventh its resolution, so this theme always arouses in Mickiewicz and Słowacki the motive of vengeance. We can follow this most clearly in the third part of Dziady, throughout the different songs which the prisoners sing. First comes Jankowski's song. "In order that I may become a believer, I must first see Jesus and Mary chastise the Tsar, who defiles my country. So long as the Tsar lives, and Novosiltsof drinks, and I myself go in fear of Siberia, so long must not anyone expect me to say Jesus, Mary." Then follow Kolakowski's ironical verses. "What does it matter if I must suffer banishment, hard labour, chains, if only as a faithful subject I am allowed to labour for my Tsar? When in the mines I have to hammer diligently and skilfully, I say to myself, this grey iron will some day become an axe for the Tsar. If I get out of the house of correction and take a young Tartar woman to wife, I say to her, bear us a Palen for the Tsar." Palen, Paul I's murderer. "If they send me out as a colonist, and I become hetman or boyar, then I will sow my field with hemp, only hemp, for the Tsar. Of hemp a halter is made, a grey halter, which can be interwoven with silver. Perhaps an Orlov may throw such a scarf around the neck of the Tsar. Orlov, murderer of Peter III. Finally, Conrad sings, "My spirit was silenced, my song lay in the grave, but my genius smelled blood, and with a shriek it rises like a vampire, eager for blood. It thirsts for blood, for blood. Yea, vengeance, vengeance, vengeance on our executioners, vengeance if God will, and whether God wills or not." We see that the poetry of vengeance has its germ here. If God will not avenge them, then the Poles must avenge themselves. Vengeance, as here pictured, almost always wears a mask, lurks behind dissimulation, strikes unexpectedly, dealing a blow long prepared. The fundamental thought is always that he who is persecuted by God and men is entitled to use all means, and that the salvation of the fatherland is the supreme law. Thus Grażyna is wholly right when, in disobedience to her husband and lord, she follows the higher call to prevent any false alliance with the hereditary enemy. And Wallenrod contains the same idea in another form. Here it is not a false alliance, but a feigned one. Against the foreign enemy, hypocrisy and treachery are legitimate weapons. Thus Wallenrod, as the master of the order, prolongs the campaign against the Lithuanians until thousands of Germans perish. When Lithuania is freed, all lost for the order, and he himself condemned to death by the secret council of the knights, with proud contempt he throws aside the mask of hypocrisy, tramples the cross of the Grand Master underfoot, and jubilantly confesses the sins of his life. It was overlooked by Mickiewicz himself, though not by his critical rival Słowacki, that in the doctrine which Wallenrod proclaims, a justification might be found for every apostasy. At any rate, misunderstanding and abuse did not frighten him. The ballad Alpujarras, which is sung at the great banquet, certainly gives the clearest expression to his train of thought. Almanzor, Prince of the Moors, is forced to surrender Granada because the plague is raging in the city. He makes his way through and flies. The Spaniards are sitting at a drinking bout, when the guard announces that a stranger begs admission for an important message which he brings. He is an Arab. "Spaniards," he cries with humble mien, "your God will I serve, your prophet will I believe in, your vassal will I be." They recognized Almanzor. The chief presses him to his heart and gives him the brotherly kiss. All the leaders embrace him, one after the other. Then he suddenly becomes faint, falls to the ground, twists his turban, and exclaims triumphantly, "I am sick of the plague." With his pretended submission he has brought the plague to the Spaniards in his brotherly kiss. So we also find Słowacki again and again singing of the curse which overtakes treachery practised towards fellow countrymen. Jan Bielecki, Wacław, the same Felix Potocki who appears in Malczewski's Maria and afterwards in Słowacki's Horsztyński, and varied again and again a glorification of deceit or surprises practised against the enemy. Lambro, Kordian. Lambro is the story of a Greek who becomes a brigand and renegade in order the more safely to strike at the Turkish perpetrators of violence, an inhuman figure, the model for which is hardly to be found in life, but in the Oriental poems of Byron. Kordian is a Pole, fantastical and nervous, far too refined and delicate for the bloody task he assumes, an attempt to kill the Tsar Nicholas, a character who, although inspired by Mickiewicz, is built up on a basis of personal observation. The drama, as well as the poem, both deal solely with the thought of vengeance. It is against this fundamental idea that Zygmunt Krasiński directed his most important works. His birth and his family relations brought him to evolve a less simple doctrine from the spectacle of human suffering. Zygmunt Krasiński was born in Paris in 1812, of Polish parents who belonged to the highest aristocracy. His father entered Napoleon's army as a young man, served till he became imperial adjutant, and after Napoleon's abdication brought back the Polish regiments as a general. He became a senator and voivode, opened a grand salon for scientists and artists in Warsaw, in which classical thought had one of its strongholds, and soon appeared as one of the most faithful servants of Alexander and Nicholas. He made himself conspicuous in a most sinister manner in 1828 as a member of the Court of the Diet established to try political offenders in Poland, he alone voting for severe sentences on the conspirators. Just as he was brave in battle, so he showed himself timid, easily flattered, and tempted by the Russian government in time of peace. This high public position of the father, he succeeded Paskiewicz as governor in 1856, was a potent factor in the son's life. In spite of his absolute disagreement with his father, he felt himself bound to him by inviolable piety, and thus deprived of all freedom, not only in his personal relations, but in his literary career. When only 16 years old, he endured an insult for his father's sake which he could never forget. When in 1829 one of the popular men of Poland, Bieliński, the president of the court, was buried, all the students of the University of Warsaw attended the ceremonies in a body and left the lecture rooms empty. By his father's command, nevertheless, Zygmunt Krasiński was obliged to go to the university as usual, on which account his comrades, on the next day, fell upon him and turned him out. The scene is described in Krasiński's unfinished poem. I see the old building, in whose halls 1,000 of the same age sit, and the teachers speak from their chairs. I see the stairs which wind about like a serpent. Is it not so? I was a brave little fellow, although as yet not full grown and not strong. I came from home, went proudly past them all, knowing indeed that they hated me, but not why. They surrounded me and pressed upon me from all sides, and shouted, young noble, as if it were a disgrace to know where my ancestors are buried. I seized hold of the iron railing, but they pulled me by my hands, my feet, my cloak. Then thou didst manifest thyself to me, my good genius, saying, they are unjust, be thou more than just, forgive them and love them. Fate had dedicated him to suffering, and he did not see in the injury he had suffered an invitation to play the part which the injustice of his countrymen and the temptations of the rulers laid in his way. Just as little did it commend itself to his refined and temperate nature to make himself the favourite of the mob by a breach with his father. Both as a young and as a man he paid an exaggerated filial respect to this father, who, as a deserter, was covered with Russian honours and Polish curses. For his sake, during his whole life, he continued to be an anonymous poet, and the consciousness of having a father in the opposite camp made it impossible for him to proclaim the gospel of vengeance in his poems. He thus dared to defy one of the dogmas of his nation, and a fundamental doctrine in the literature of the time, since he proclaimed the impotence of hatred in a nation passionate by temperament, martial by instinct, and besides so tortured and desperate that all the products of its imaginative power hitherto had been not only sombre as a clouded heaven, but traversed by the lightning of vindictiveness. Touching the productions of the other poets, he says in Wallenrod, murder and fire, that is what you Wajdelots, Lithuanian bards, love to sing about. You leave honour and the pangs of death to us. From the cradle your song winds itself like a serpent around the breast of the child, and pours its poison into his soul. The insane yearning for glory and the insane love of country. But none of them had such a feeling of responsibility as Krasiński. He suffered terribly when he heard of the cruel punishments inflicted on young students for having circulated his forbidden poems. Krasiński again describes only sufferings. In Iridion he represents the suffering which a foreign rule actually caused, and gives a picture of ancient Greece some hundreds of years after it was conquered by Rome. he depicts the love of the most eminent Greeks for Hellas as the land to which Europe owes all noble culture, the land which first taught her the significance of political freedom, and portrays the hatred of Rome, the cruel and haughty master of Greece, from which her half-barbaric culture was borrowed. The drama shows us the national spirit of Greece, pondering on a great work of revenge, after centuries of oppression and dishonour, at a time when the terrible abuse of power of Caracalla and Heliogabalus had excited the minds of all the better sort of people. Iridion is the son of revenge, child of the avenger. He is the son of the great Greek Amphilochos, who himself belonged to a generation for which revenge did not seem ripe, but who had impressed upon Iridion and his sister Elsinoe, his 2 children, by a northern woman, hatred of Rome. When he blessed them while they were sleeping as little children, he said to them, "Remember to hate Rome and avenge yourselves. Thou, Iridion, with fire and sword, thou, Elsinoe, with all a woman's shrewdness and perfidious art." And in his palace in Rome, Iridion lives solely for the idea of revenge, and in its service unites his charming sister to the weak and miserable boy who is the head of the state. Elsinoe bends Heliogabalus like a reed, and Iridion explains to the emperor that it is not his rival, Alexander Severus, but the city of Rome itself that is his enemy. He should wage that war against the city which Nero began with the conflagration, and then transfer the imperial throne to Byzantium. And Heliogabalus is fascinated by this poetry of annihilation on a vast scale, which captivates him, as it has captivated better men than he, Polish poets, for example. Krasiński justly felt that for most of his countrymen of that time, Poland had gradually become only a name, which called for vengeance. He saw the danger to the nation's sense of right, which lay in its having come to believe that everything was allowable as against the oppressor. Even in the poem to the Polish mother, falsehood, hypocrisy, and fraud were painted as virtues. Thus no one had regarded it as wrong that the hero of Ostrołęka, General Bem, had professed Mohammedanism simply in order the better to strike at Russia in the Turkish service. So no one at a later period regarded it as wrong in Wielopolski that, in an open letter to Metternich, after the massacres in Galicia, he preached the merging of the people in Russia, in the hope that union with the most powerful enemy would procure vengeance on the 2 other enemies, Austria and Prussia, which a new Attila might then crush. Krasiński was alarmed at this national feeling, which lived only in hate, at this patriotism which was even stronger than death, but always carried death in its mouth. He wrote Iridion to warn his people. At the last moment all Iridion's schemes miscarry, because of the distrust he arouses in the Christian bishops. Elsinoe demands the death of Heliogabalus, to avenge herself for what she has suffered by being his mistress. Then she kills herself. Alexander Severus conquers, and becomes emperor, and Iridion would fain die when Massinissa, his bad tutelary genius, the Widelot of Wallenrod on a grander scale, and moreover a kind of incarnation of the horror of antiquity for the institution of Christianity, carries him away in space. In the distance he sees from a height on the coast Rome, showing its marble in the sun, as the tiger shows its white teeth. And a fear comes upon him that Rome will not be destroyed as his mother had foretold. Massinissa then informs him that the Goths, it is true, will trample Rome into ruins, but that the Christians will then create a new Rome, which will take the warriors of the north in leading strings, and once more rule all the nations of the world. Krasiński wished to show his people, in one grand example, that the mere thirst for vengeance produces nothing durable, and that hatred is unfruitful. In addition, perhaps, as Klaczko has keenly observed, he wished to hint that the enemy may find a new lease of life where it is least to be expected, as Rome found the basis of its second period of greatness in Christianity, the successors of the Teutonic Order, a like fundamental force in the Reformation. It may be Russia will find it in the civilization of our century. the very force which would seem to be a threat against Russia. The epilogue transports us to the papal Rome of 1830. Iridion wanders with Massinissa over the ruins of old Rome and among those of its later splendor. The ruling power is represented by two old men in purple mantles, whom some monks salute and call princes of the church. They are seated in a carriage with a pair of old black horses, and a servant stands behind with a lantern. These are the successors of the Caesars, says Massinissa. Iridion no longer hates Christianity, whose fate now seems to him as sorrowful as formerly did that of Greece. At last Iridion hears a voice which calls to him, "Go north in the name of Christ, and stop first in the land of graves and crosses. Thou mayst know it by the silence of its warriors and the melancholy of its little children. Thou mayst know it by the huts of its poor, destroyed by fire, and the palaces of its exiles, which have been laid waste. Go there, and dwell among the new brethren, whom I give to thee. This shall be thy second trial. For the second time thou shalt see the object of thy love pierced through, and in the death, struggle, and the sufferings of thousands of souls shall be contained in thy heart." The moral, then, is this: your task in the land of graves and crosses, as in the land of temples and cypresses, is not the making war upon your enemy by all means, but the conquering him by intellectual and moral superiority. Krasiński's doctrine, proclaimed again and again, is this: not to expect better times from the evil we may wish to inflict upon our enemies, but from the good we develop in our own minds. What he fears is the poison which thraldom engenders and secretes in the soul. To him Siberia, the knout, and tortures are less terrible than to see the national spirit poisoned in the thirst for vengeance. Consequently, we have this radical contrast. On the one hand, the recklessness of despair, which sanctions everything if it only strikes the tyrant. The act of Grażyna, the fraud and treachery of Wallenrod, the plague kiss of Almansor, Kordian's attempt at murder. On the other, when Paskiewicz is ruler in Warsaw, a voice which warns against unproductive hatred, and which, when it is answered with derision on account of its supposed cowardice, is content again and again to point at efforts towards a higher culture, by which to eclipse and thus to conquer the enemy through intellectual development and purification. There are two great leading principles in the battle of life. The one is earthly and the other spiritual. The former has the more immediate results of an act in view, the latter the more remote. The former is to this effect: since life is full of horrors, then make thine enemy harmless by annihilating him. For this all means are lawful. The other is to this effect: since life is full of horrors, diminish their number by returning hate with love. Love thine enemy. Disarm him by a self-esteem which only unfolds itself in love, and which, stronger than death, everywhere awakens life. The former is Conrad's and Kordian's, the latter is the principle of the great Anonymous. Perhaps they are both equally unpractical, as between nation and nation. The one because vengeance continually calls forth vengeance anew, the other because love, as the only principle, is inadequate in a world when the gentleness of the lamb does not protect it against the teeth of the wolf. But it is these two principles, both equally romantic, which permeate the romantic literature of Poland. There is also a third, unromantic and unsentimental principle. It teaches neither to exterminate nor to love your enemy, but to work more and better than he. The future belongs neither to the avenger nor to the apostle, but to him who labors with genius. End of section 30.
Section 31 of Poland, A Study of the Land, People and Literature by George Brandis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Piotr Nater. The character of Hamlet in Poland. The type of Hamlet conceived on radical lines by Słowacki and on conservative lines by Krasiński. There is yet another variety of the Avenger, with much of the type of the prophet in it, which has not yet been touched upon, and which must be treated apart. It is that group of figures in the romantic literature of Poland which may be called Hamlet characters. In the literature of the Renaissance there is this one great type from which modern poetry may be dated, Shakespeare's Hamlet, springing originally from the English sense of reality and the skepticism of Montaigne. As Hamlet is the first philosophical drama of the more modern times, so also here for the first time the typical modern man appears with his keen sense of the contest between ideals and surroundings, of the disproportion between strength and task, with all his variety of spiritual being, delicate feeling and cruelty, his wit without merriment, his everlasting procrastination and furious impatience. Much of the most modern of the poetry of the 19th century derives from Hamlet. In Germany, Goethe interprets him in Wilhelm Meister, and the remodeled Hamlet calls Faust to mind. When Faust was transplanted to English soil, Byron's Manfred springs up, a new, if remoter, heir of Hamlet. But in Germany, the Byronic nature even assumes a new and Hamlet-like, Yorick-like, form in Heine's bitter and fantastic wit, in his hatred and caprice and intellectual superciliousness. The generation to which Alfred de Musset belonged in France, and which he described in his Confessions d'Enfant du siècle, nervous, inflammable as powder, with its wings prematurely clipped, without the field for its thirst for action, and without energy in its actual field, forcibly reminds us of the type. And perhaps the best of Musset's masculine characters, Lorenzaccio, becomes the French Hamlet, skilled in dissimulation, languid, brilliant, gentle with women, yet wounding them with harsh words, morbidly desirous of remedying the unimportance and foolishness of his life by a deed, and acting desperately, uselessly, and too late. Hamlet, who centuries ago had been young England, and who to Musset for a long time was young France, afterwards became the name by which the Germany of the 50s christened itself. Hamlet is Germany, sang Freiligrath. In the development of Polish Romanticism there comes a time when its poets are inclined to say Hamlet is Poland. It was the result of kindred political circumstances that the character of Hamlet, even at the same time, but still more 20 years after, came to dominate another Slav literature, the Russian, where we can trace it from the productions of Pushkin and Gogol to those of Goncharov and Tolstoy, while in Turgenev's works it really occupies the chief place. But we shall see that the peculiar point in the Hamlet consciousness, the vocation of vengeance, is wanting here, because all the emphasis is laid on the disagreement between reflection and energy in general. On the other hand, we find marked traits of Hamlet's nature in all the Polish political geniuses. From their youth up, they all stand in his position. The world is out of joint, and it is to be set right by their weak arms. High-born and noble-minded as they are, they all feel like Hamlet the inward fire and outward impotence of their youth. Conceiving the conditions which surround them as one supreme horror, they are constituted at once for dreaming and for action, for musing and for recklessness. Like Hamlet, they have seen their mother, the country to which they owe their lives, dishonoured under the hand of crowned robbers and murderers. The court, access to which is sometimes open to them, frightens them, as the court of Claudius frightened the Danish prince. These descendants of Hamlet are, like him, cruel to their Ophelia. They abandon her when she loves them best. Like him, they suffer themselves to be sent away to foreign lands, and when they speak, they dissemble like him, clothe their meaning in comparisons and allegories. Finally, what Hamlet says of himself holds good of them. Yet have I in me something dangerous. The peculiarly Polish feature is that what weakens them and hinders them is not their self-consciousness, but their poetry. While the Germans of this type are ruined by self-consciousness, the French by debauchery, the Russians by sloth, self-irony, and self-abandonment, it is imagination which leads the Poles astray, and causes them to live a life at variance with the true life. It is true that the Hamlet character has many different sides. Hamlet is the doubter, and,
committed to inaction by all sorts of scruples and considerations, is a man of brains, who now acts nervously, now, unmanned by nervousness, does not dare to act. Finally, he is the avenger, the man who dissembles in order to be better able to avenge himself. Every one of these aspects is developed by the Polish poets. There is little of Hamlet in the personal character of Mickiewicz, if we accept the almost insane transport at an idea which appeared in him at the moment when Towiański entered into his existence. From this time forth the liberation of Poland became a religion, a certainty for him. He wanted to write to Nicholas, to convert Rothschild, in order to win them to his cause. The chair of Slav history and literature, which the monarchy of July had bestowed on him at the College of France, was taken from him, when his lectures came to consist merely of the development of fantastic patriotic theories, 1844. But he possessed energy. In 1848 he tried to form a regiment of Poles in Italy. During the reign of Napoleon III, who, according to his belief, was to realize the Messiah promises of the great Napoleon, he filled for some years the modest position of librarian at the Arsenal, which the Emperor had given him, but during the Crimean War he travelled to Turkey to raise a Polish legion against Russia. He died there, in the midst of these efforts, in November 1855. Nevertheless, there is a glimpse of something like Hamlet in several of the characters he created: Wallenrod, Gustavus, Konrad, Robak. Gustavus speaks the language of significant insanity. Konrad loses himself in philosophical reveries. Wallenrod and Robak dissemble or disguise themselves in the service of vengeance, and the latter, like Hamlet, kills the father of his beloved. The Hamlet nature plays a far greater role in the character of Słowacki. He was wild and gentle, unruly and ivy-like. In life clung to his friends, in art to predecessors, lived not with his whole person, but with his head, in his ideas and his fancy. His imagination is richly colored and melodious, decorative and sonorous, but he is wholly lacking in the plastic sense. It is on this account that Krasiński's advice to him is so excellent: put granite under your rainbows. Practically, he was greatly influenced by his consciousness of rivalry with Mickiewicz. His poetical writings are mainly governed by this. In the history of the Middle Ages we read of anti-popes. Słowacki belongs to the race of anti-popes. His real originality is that of form. So far as characters and fundamental themes are concerned, he is almost wholly limited by the models he imitates, and the rivals he strives to outstrip or contradict. Thus we can trace all the more plainly the general tendencies of Polish literature in his receptive nature. His drama Kordian, written in sight of Mont Blanc, which seemed to Słowacki a carved statue of Siberia, is founded on the coronation conspiracy against the Tsar Nicholas. The conspirators here hold their meetings in a church at night, and the young Polish nobleman, Kordian, the man of heart, offers to commit the murder of the Tsar. Nothing could be more Hamlet-like than Kordian's answer to the president's exclamation, "Thou hast a fever, thine eyes are wild." Kordian: "It is nothing, old man. It is my hair which has become white and consumes my skull. I feel every one of my hairs suffering the pangs of death. But that amounts to nothing. Plant 2 poplars and a rosebush on my grave. Streams of tears will water them, and I shall have hair on my head again. Hast thou a pen? I would fain write the names of those who will lament me. My father, dead. My mother, dead. All my relatives, dead. She, worse than dead. Therefore I shall leave none behind me, they are all with me, and the gallows will be my monument." The President: "Kordian, there is the note thou gavest the conspirators. Take it, burn it, and be free of thy word." Kordian: "1, 2, 3. Carry arms. Sentinel on the castle. Take care. What foolish words! They are to teach one how to walk. Old man, you irritate me with your peaceful countenance. I cannot forget that I shall never be old. If I ever surround thee with my flock of children, then spit on my white hair. I permit it. The clock strikes 11. It is heaven which calls me. Hastens out. Cordian's entrance into the castle is now described in a great fantastic scene. He keeps the watch for the night, and, with his carbine on his arm, he goes towards the emperor's bedroom, while the voices of imagination and fear speak to him incessantly. Imagination says, "Listen to me, I speak to thine eyes." Fear says, "Listen to me, I speak in the beating of my heart, until walls and columns become serpents and sphinxes, the floor lives, the plants have ears, the flowers move, and long funeral processions wind from the church into the castle, caskets, sceptres, crowns, corpses, and ever more corpses, while the church bells chime." Cordian falls down on the floor with his arm around his bayonet. He was not equal to the deed. The Polish tendency to phantasmagoria intervened between him and his action. Not less Hamlet-like is the earlier, finely worked out scene in Cordian, in which Cordian, as an emigrant, has an audience with the Pope, the same Gregory XVI who, in July 1832, in a letter to the bishops of Poland, had condemned the Polish Revolution as rebellion against the legitimate ruler, and praised the high-minded Tsar who, thank God, had restored order and peace. The scene takes place in the Vatican. The Pope is sitting in his chair. On a stool by his side is his tiara. On it a red-breasted parrot. A chamberlain opens the door for Cordian and announces in a loud voice, "Count Cordian, a Polish nobleman." The Pope: "Welcome, descendant of Sobieski." He extends his foot. Cordian kneels and kisses it. Poland is constantly overwhelmed with benefactions from heaven, is she not? Daily I thank God in the name of this happy land, for the Emperor, who is really like an angel with an olive leaf, ever has the best disposition towards the Catholic religion. We ought to sing hosannas. The parrot shrilly, "Miserere!" Cordian: "I bring you here, Holy Father, a holy relic. It is a handful of the earth, where 10,000 men, children, old people, and women were murdered, without even the sacrament of the altar beforehand. Treasure it where you treasure the presence of the Tsar, and in return give me a tear, only a tear." The parrot: "Lacrimae Christi." The Pope: "Tomorrow you shall see me in all my majesty distributing blessings to the city and the world. You shall see whole races on their knees before me. Let the Poles pray to God, reverence the Tsar, and hold fast by their religion." Cordian: "But this handful of bloody earth, does no one bless it? What shall I answer to my friends?" The parrot: "De profundis clamavi, clamavi." The Pope: "My son, may God lead thee, and grant thy people may tear the germs of Jacobinism out of their bosom, and wholly and entirely devote themselves to honouring God and cultivating the earth, henceforth holding nothing in their hands but psalm book, hoe, and rake." Cordian, throwing his handful of earth into the air: "I throw the ashes of the martyrs to all the winds. With a sorrowful soul I return to my native land." The Pope: "If the Poles be conquered, thou canst be sure that I shall be the first to excommunicate them. May religion increase like an olive tree, and may the people live in peace in its shade." The parrot: "Hallelujah!" And if in Słowacki we find the radically disposed type of Hamlet, the conservative Hamlet meets us in Krasiński, who for so many years was Słowacki's friend and supporter. The poet was not able to develop his views of life from within with perfect freedom. A certain reserve was imposed upon him by his position as his father's son and by a heritage of aristocratic tendencies. Often and often his personality was plainly in an inward strife, constantly suppressed, with the doctrine he proclaimed and the view of life he advocated, a view of life which has all the advantage of an elevated mode of thought hostile to the mob, but which is never young, not even in the first youth. The hero of the Godless Comedy has more than one trait in common with the most celebrated of all Danes. He has Hamlet's sensitiveness and force of imagination. He strives towards an ideal, but yet stands outside reality, poetizing his life. He is punished for the absurd difficulty of his character by the insanity of his wife, just as Hamlet is punished for his pretended madness by the real insanity of Ophelia. But this Hamlet is torn by a more intense inward conflict, and devoured by deeper doubt than the Hamlet of the Renaissance. The latter doubts whether the spirit, whose cause he espouses, is anything more than a phantom. When Count Henry shuts himself up in the castle of the Holy Trinity, he is not sure that the Holy Trinity is more than this. He has no faith, only the need of faith. He is conservative and clerical, not from conviction, but from the fear that the forces that are besieging this castle are only destructive forces. For political reasons he supports a religious system as to which he hears from his coarse antagonist Pancratius, the democratic leader, a character like Renan's Caliban, the harshest truths, without being able to refute them. When Pancratius unfolds his utopias to him, it is of little use that he has the answer ready, "You do not yourself believe in them." When the latter, to his remark about the human race, all being saved through Christ, can retort, "Why then has he not helped man in the 2000 years of misery and wretchedness which have elapsed since his death? Are you created in the image of man, or in that of the nursery?" This pang is peculiar to the Polish Hamlet. Krasiński cherished no illusion as to a speedy resurrection of the Kingdom of Poland. He regarded the whole of Western European civilization, including that of Poland, as doomed. Nay, even Christianity seemed to him to be dying, although he himself always wrote in a Christian spirit. When he made his appearance as an aristocratic conservative in his poems, it was with the agonizing feeling that he was defending the bad for fear of the worse. The adversities of his private life and national misfortunes combined to crush him early. From his 34th year he was a broken down old man, afflicted with nervous debility and a disease of the eyes. The 13 years he had still to live were an uninterrupted struggle with death. It has already been stated that Hamlet was, so to speak, introduced at the court of Claudius by him. The episode occurs in this beautiful poem, The Temptation, a typical example of the symbolical form of representation in which the political conditions of those days compelled the poets of Poland to express themselves. The poem dwells plainly enough on personal recollections of Krasiński's youthful residence in St. Petersburg, and is, moreover, a fantastic representation of what he would have experienced in life if he had followed his father's example. The poem opens, mysteriously, with an invocation, "O mother, 6 times pierced, unhappy mother," and describes a landscape where on a gentle rising hill a coffin lies under a slender fir tree. In the coffin is a figure with chains on the hands and a crown on the forehead. 6 hills are separated by green furrows, where blood runs like bubbling brooks, and weeds sprout over broken weapons. Then the poet describes the arrival of a young noble at a great city and a great castle, by the stairs of which all ascend as eagerly as if they were going up to heaven. There is the sound of many musical instruments, perfumes surround the newcomer, he sees a throne in the sunlight elevated above the crowd of dancers. On the throne sits the absolute ruler of life and death, under a canopy of flags. From one of these flags, which is torn in tatters, drops of blood now and then fall, but no one pays any attention to them except the youth. The crowd separates, and the lord of the castle steps down from the throne and goes, erect and vigorous, towards the young man. The youth looks him steadfastly in the eyes. The ruler knits his brows and says gently, "Come, let us go together, and I will show you the wonders of my castle." And when the youth stands as if lost in a dream, he gives him a kiss on his forehead and leads him away. With his mother's coffin before his eyes, the young man walks by the side of the ruler of life and death, and the blood in his arm beats against the hard arm of the usurper. And the latter speaks of the past, even mentions the name of the murdered mother without shuddering, as if her death did not rest upon his conscience. They pass through rows of men whose foreheads touch the malachite floor. Then, at the other end of the castle, marble doors are suddenly opened. The youth looks into an enormous treasury, into mines of endless extent. Fountains of flowing gold and silver shine with blended splendor, and amethyst vaults rear themselves in all the colors of the rainbow. but now and then there is also heard, as it were, a shriek of someone dying, a clanking of chains. Now and then human forms pass by like black cloudlets over the moon. They raise their hands with a clang and pray for a drop of water. Then the eyes of the ruler grow blood red with wrath. From this time all show honor to the young man. They wish to kiss the hand which has touched that of the ruler. They offer him goblets full of costly wine, and a beautiful young woman speaks to him of love. In the throne room the Lord of Life and Death has given the youth a place at the table by his side under the conquered flags. Ambassadors from the kings of the East and of the West appear before the ruler, and every general puts at the foot of the throne an urn of pure gold, full of the ashes of those who have fallen in battle for the holy cause in the different quarters of the globe. The ruler asks, "Are they really dead, and will they never rise again?" The answer comes, "Certainly never," and the urns are ranged on both sides of the hall on black granite columns. Fire is laid in them, and they burn with a bluish flame. Pale clouds of incense convey the odour of the dead to the ruler. Directly opposite the young man stands the urn which bears his mother's name and contains the ashes of her sons. As often as he looks on it, he forgets his beaker, but the beautiful woman by his side continually offers it to him again. A veil spreads itself over his consciousness. Then the ruler smiles and says, "You are my guest. It is time that you take the oath of allegiance to me and renounce your old name." And he throws a handful of diamond crosses to him with the words, "Wear them in remembrance of me." A herald steps forward, and out of a black book he reads aloud the formula of the oath to the young man, who repeats it with sunken head, while it becomes dark before his eyes. He has hardly ended when the Lord of Life and Death rises and calls out, "You slave of my slaves, you shall die by the halter if you break your oath." Then he smiles with scorn. But when the youth raises his eyes, he reads on the urn, where his mother's name was written, only the one word, "Dishonour," and thousands shout, "Dishonour!" to him, before him, around him. "Dishonour!" resounds in the vaults of the castle, from the throne room to the treasury. It was all a dream, from which the youth awakes, and the poem ends as it began, with an enthusiastic invocation of the 6 times pierced mother. As already indicated, the poem is an expression of the Polish Hamlet's horror of the court of Claudius. But only a partial representation of the peculiarity and versatility of these Polish writers is given by laying stress upon their analogies with Hamlet. Hamlet's antithesis in Shakespeare's tragedy is Fortinbras, the rejuvenating principle of fresh reality, who inherits the throne and the kingdom when all else is lost and poisoned. There is also a glimmering of the nature of Fortinbras in several of these poets, but the very essence of that which he symbolically represents lives in Mickiewicz. In Mickiewicz there was a fountain of bubbling, youthful power. There was something in him which was freshness itself, irresistibility itself, a something which is expressed in words in the Ode to Youth and in the immortal poem Faris. It is youth which believes in being able to tear the old world out of its groves, and which makes the attempt. It is youth which, like Faris or the Jehu of Scripture, drives furiously. It is before this that birds of prey take flight, and hurricanes must yield. This tumultuous force and self-confidence is not to be found so primitively either in Słowacki or Krasiński. It is from this force in Mickiewicz that springs a passion as exalted as that which stretches the bow in the 3rd part of Dziady, and a masculine equilibrium of thought, such as that which is disclosed in the masterpiece of Polish literature, Pan Tadeusz. Such robustness of emotion is not found in any other Polish poet. Mickiewicz alone approached those great names in poetry which stand in history as above all healthy, far healthier than Byron, healthier even than Shakespeare, Homer and Goethe. It is not by the healthfulness of his soul that Krasiński raises himself above his period and belongs to the future. It is by the loftiness of his soul, the sublimity of his outlook, and his mode of thought. His works have not the blush of health, but the purity of colourlessness. There is a defiant independence in his isolated position, a peculiar foresight in his views as to the danger of inciting the people against the Polish nobility, those views which Słowacki arrogantly and scornfully ridiculed, but which received an apparently incontrovertible justification when the peasants of Galicia, in 1846, were paid by Metternich's agent, Brindle, 5 gulden for every living and 10 for every murdered Polish nobleman. There is finally a depth of understanding in the godless comedy, the genius of which surprises us when we remember that it was composed by a youth of 21. It is neither their robustness nor their independence that will enable Słowacki's productions to defy time. It is true that, in religious respects, he is more liberal, in political more audacious than his great rivals, but he is so as much from a spirit of contradiction as from conviction. No one is more brilliant than he. He has the genuine Polish love for show and colour, he for whom the divine was symbolized by the plume in the helmet. But if he has the Polish love for pomp, he has, above everything else, the common Slavic faculty for imitation. In almost every one of his works we are distracted in our enjoyment by the recollection of a very definite exemplar. The manner in which he appropriates Shakespeare is Slavish. His Balladina, a blending of Midsummer Night's Dream, King Lear, and Macbeth, in which beautiful single passages and profound scenes are to be found, but in which the elements are inharmoniously adjusted to each other, leaves a painful impression as a whole, in spite of the boldness of certain conceptions. He has utterly ruined his treatment of the tragedy of Beatrice Cenci, supplanting the study of the human soul by a long drawn-out romantic dance of witches, a mere dilution of the witch theme, treated with the judicious reserve of the master in Macbeth. His Cenci is far behind Shelley's much earlier and more admirable version of the same theme, with which Słowacki was evidently not acquainted, otherwise he would have imitated it. His Mary Stuart is more independent and characteristic. It follows, almost act for act, the same portion of the life of the Scottish Queen, afterwards treated by Björnson, and Słowacki's Mary, as a character, is more interesting and more important than Björnson's, while the treatment as a whole is more lyrical. Słowacki was perhaps too much taken up by himself to become properly absorbed in humanity before he described men. He studied human life less than the works of Byron, Shakespeare, Mickiewicz, Krasiński, and finally Calderon. So he drew figures half living, half dreamlike, characters of which some fragments are true, others incorrect, and concealed the weakness of the drawing by throwing the rainbow glow of his diction over it. His style is bold and eloquent, but seldom closely knit. Its strength and weakness is its overwhelming richness of colour. There is no bird which in strength of wing and power of flight can rival the eagle. Fitly it is called the king of birds. There is no bird which, in unblemished whiteness and quiet dignity of movement, can rival the swan. Fitly it is called the symbol of noble purity. The peacock cannot fly like the eagle, nor sail like the swan, but neither of them can come near it in the incomparable splendour of its plumage. Mickiewicz is the eagle, Krasiński the swan, Słowacki the peacock among the winged spirits of Poland. End of chapter 31.
Section 32 of Poland, A Study of the Land, People and Literature, by George Brandis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Piotr Nater. Pan Tadeusz, The Only Epopee of the Century. Mickiewicz and Drzewuski. Importance of Mickiewicz. Among the works which these poets have produced, there is a single book which competent judges at an early day pronounced to be the best poetical work in Polish literature. It is the only work in which one of the three great poets has attempted to give a picture of the many-sided national culture during a period of agitation of which he was himself a witness. The only work in which we find a broad and rich representation of the natural scenery of Poland, the only one in which the poet does not think it beneath him to let everyday men appear in large numbers. Finally, the only one in which the keynote is no longer that of tragical or lyrical exaltation, but a quiet humour, from which the passage to satire, tenderness, melancholy, or enthusiasm is easy. As we all know, the number of epic poems of real value is small, but certain of these works remain in the literature of the world as essential books, national books, in which a whole nation or race has found its character described, its life embodied in true and living form. They belong to remote times, like the patriarchal books of the Old Testament, like Homer, Ramayana, Firdusi, the Nibelungenlied. The reason is that the naive consciousness of a nation generally expresses itself for the first time in a genuine epic. It comes into existence when the nation has such a clear understanding of itself that it can enjoy a glorified reflection of its conditions in art, and yet has not become so civilized that its religion has stiffened into dogmas and its forms of society into a commonwealth of police or of law. For the conditions are epic, that is to say, in the broadest sense heroic, only when the ruling power does not lie outside of the individual, and has not destroyed independent activity, as it is destroyed when discipline and command rule in war, and royal power, official force, and even more powerful society standards in time of peace. In Homer, every single leader is an independent Greek. Even if Agamemnon is the king of kings, the other kings are not under his scepter. We meet with similar conditions in the epic poems of far later times, as in the Cid of the Spaniards, and in the Italians Ariosto and Tasso, even if the naivete is weaker here, and the Virgilian models, notably in Tasso, have a depressing effect. Tasso's Jerusalem could be a genuine national book only in so far as the people delighted in the sound of the verses and in the brilliant adventures. It did not find its own life reproduced therein. The attempt to create a national epic failed most conspicuously when Voltaire wrote the Henriade in the 18th century. From that time all thinking men began to understand that wholly peculiar conditions are demanded for the production of a national epic poem, and that it could hardly be written in an intellectual age, since it was neither probable that we should be able to find that naivete in a poet, nor that primitive anarchy in a period he knew and could describe, on which the power of the great epics to strike deep into the national consciousness seems hitherto to have deepened. Since naivete has again come to honor and dignity in this century, and since poets have again become childlike to some extent, and to some extent have simulated simplicity, they have tried to avoid the regularity of modern conditions by laying the scene of their epic essays in grey antiquity. It is in the nature of the epic to give a broad picture of the culture of the people, with a detailed description of their entire manner of living, their eating and drinking, their dress and dwelling, manners and customs. In Homer all this still lives. The Homeric man and woman find themselves again in their surroundings. Odysseus has himself fashioned his bed, the women have themselves woven their apparel, the king's daughters themselves attend to the washing, the men themselves pitch their tents, or build their houses. Nothing of their own is strange to them, nothing, like the dwellings or materials of our own days, is the product of a manufactory or of a machine. The heroes themselves gained their rare weapons, each of which has its own peculiarity, by fighting or as a booty. When the Scandinavian authors, shrinking from their own organized and regulated age and the tyranny of factory and machine, turned back to antiquity, they produced narrative poems like Hrolf Krake and Frithjof, books of a certain qualified value, but which have no deep intellectual interest, because they have not the slightest resemblance to the period they represent. The only modern poets who have succeeded in producing anything which has the character of an epic are Byron, whose Don Juan is a picture of the world, although in its nature it is a bitter, glowingly sensual, wrathful satire, and before him Goethe, who in Hermann and Dorothea reproduced something of the simplest and best substance of the German people in the old art form of the narrative poem.
The types here are plain, of homely grandeur. Hermann and Dorothea stand before the reader's eyes as the German Adam and Eve, but the epic foundation is slender, family life in a little German town, pastor and apothecary, the landlord and landlady of the inn, the relations between parents and the grown-up son. But as background we have the French Revolution, the fugitive emigrants who bring from the left bank of the Rhine the orphaned, homeless girl who Hermann leads to his home and to his parents, the contrast between vagrancy and the coziness of a provincial town, between upheaval and bourgeois stagnation, is also indicated here. The whole is less an epic than an idyll of family life on an epic background. In Pan Tadeusz, Poland possesses the only successful epic our century has produced. The good star of Mickiewicz ordained that this time he should not go back to the remote past in order to produce something epic. Here he succeeded in seeing the heroic in his own age. Elizabeth Browning, in the beautiful and eloquent verse of her Aurora Leigh, has a memorable passage as to the possibility of seeing this. She says, "Every age, through being beheld too close, is ill discerned by those who have not lived past it, will suppose Mount Athos carved, as Alexander schemed, to some colossal statue of a man. The peasants, gathering brushwood in his ear, had guessed as little as the browsing goats of form or feature of humanity up there. In fact, had travelled 5 miles off, or ere the giant image broke on them, full human profile, nose and chin distinct, mouth muttering rhythms of silence up the sky." Thus the ordinary man and the ordinary poet do not see the contours of the age in which they live. Mickiewicz was the rare epic poet in this sense that he succeeded fully in reproducing not only the origin and source of the customs of his native land, but all the greatness and all the poetry which the period about the year 1812 had in its bosom for Poland. He dared to found a whole epic on his own observation. Its genesis is remarkable. It emanated from Mickiewicz's feeling of despair when the revolution of 1831, in which he had not participated, was crushed. In 1832, after Garczyński's death, he writes, "I am like a Frenchman on the retreat from Russia, demoralized, weak, almost without boots." He became reserved, gloomy, sullen, misanthropic, and negligent in his dress. To escape this despairing dejection, he turned back to the land of his childhood, Lithuania, in which he had seen the light, which he had not visited since the years of his early youth, and which he, the exile, was never to see again. And he who as a poet, directly or through disguises, had always spoken only in his own name, he who had defied and incited, protested and agitated, became an epic poet of perfect calm and mighty breadth. He achieved the epic naivete, which is so rare and so costly, which was denied to all other poets in and out of Poland, for a double reason. Firstly, because of a peculiarity in his relation to his subject, and secondly, because of a peculiarity in the subject itself. The other poets lacked naivete, but he, who had only seen his fatherland with the eyes of a child, and never could see it again with the eyes of a mature man, had never had this picture clouded. He received in compensation for this exclusion from the land of his fathers the long-lost gifts of the epic poet. The naive feeling of growing up with the country, its customs and conditions as they were when he was a child. And then it happened that the subject which presented itself to him had just the characteristics of the old epic subjects. Lithuanian life about 1812 was an entirely civilized condition in its way, yet one wholly outside of the monotonous cosmopolitan civilization. Everything in this Szlachta epos was therefore as untouched by the culture of Western Europe as are the enormous primeval forests of Lithuania by forestry. Here everything is original, from the peculiar food of the country, with its wonderful names, to the variegated dress, żupan, kontusz, konfederatka. There is a wealth of characteristic customs, there is even a special costume in which to collect edible sponges. And every weapon, every club, every sabre, every gun has a history which is told. Originals swarm here. Every other person who appears is an original of the primeval forest. Here there is neither supremacy nor the discipline. The relation between the upper classes and the servants is still, as in the Middle Ages, a purely personal relation, not infrequently a passionate attachment. Finally, in this aristocratic epopee there is a relation between the nobles, such as we see between the princes in Homer. A wild independence blossoms here, in spite of apparent subordination to a king, a state of things unknown elsewhere in Europe. Men do justice for themselves with weapons in their hands. They acknowledge no superior, carry on war and give battle on a small scale, rend the land with internecine conflicts until the coming of the Russian drives the enemies into each other's arms, and Napoleon's entry into Poland lights the fire of patriotic enthusiasm. But the anarchy of the nobility, which in the world of reality had shown itself so fatal to the existence of Poland, proved, as if in compensation, so admirable an epic subject, that Poland got its only epos by virtue of that very condition which annihilated the country as a state. And Mickiewicz, describing this host of Don Quixotes with love and humour, opened up vistas in the past and the future, which explained the glorious past of his people and its present ruin. The action lasts from the summer of 1811 to the spring of 1812. By choosing this point of time, his hopeful nature found scope in his poem, this epos of a humiliated people, for he could close with a lyric flight, an inspired burst of consolation. He had experienced this popular feeling when, as a boy, he saw the entrance of the French battalions into Novogródek. In his travels in the Crimea, Mickiewicz had as fellow traveller the somewhat older Henryk Rzewuski, the heir of one of the old families of the great nobility of Poland. This intellectual man, an excellent narrator, had been educated in a reactionary, aristocratic circle, which swore by Bonald and de Maistre. In 1812 he had made the personal acquaintance of de Maistre in St. Petersburg, and he appeared first in private life, afterwards in literature, as an uncompromising spokesman of his master, the greatest champion of authority of the age. Rzewuski abounded in recollections of the life of the Polish nobility of the 18th century. He was endowed with a literary talent of which he was not conscious. When Mickiewicz was residing in Rome and passed 2 winters in company with Rzewuski, the poet urged him to write. He inferred the talent of written description from his gift of oral narrative. When, in response to his suggestion, Rzewuski produced some verses which Mickiewicz pronounced bad, the latter did not on that account mistrust his own judgment, for he had perceived from the beginning that the talent of Rzewuski could only manifest itself in a prose form. Therefore he earnestly advised him to write prose. Rzewuski followed this advice and succeeded. Strange to say, this prose afterwards had a reflex influence upon Mickiewicz. Rzewuski wrote a thick volume of memoirs of the previous century in the style of the period. The fictitious author was Severin Soplica, one of the servants and adherents of Prince Charles Radziwiłł. In those loosely knit memoirs, which give glowing pictures of the time, rich in strong features and with admirable descriptions of character, the leading personage is that Prince Radziwiłł, so popular in Lithuania, called Panie Kochanku, on account of his favourite form of salutation, "Dear Sir, dear friend." The time of the action is about 1770. When the book appeared in 1839, it was received with great enthusiasm. It was read as if it were a volume of genuine reminiscences. It was completed in 1832, and it is probable that Mickiewicz had received from Rzewuski the incentive to deal with the Poland of the end of the 18th century. That his hero also bears the family name of Soplica implies this. At the close of 1832, he began the elaboration of Pantadeusz, which, in a letter written in December, he characterizes as a rural poem in the style of Hermann and Dorothea, of which he has altogether scribbled 1,000 verses. While he was writing it, he felt as if he were transported to Lithuania. In February 1834 he finished the poem, which for the rest he mentions carelessly, with a certain lack of respect, as a piece of nonsense, in comparison to Dziady, which he means to continue in order to finish his one work worth reading. Wonderfully enough, the public soon judged far more justly than the author himself in this matter. He did not even appreciate his good fortune in lighting upon such an untouched subject, such primitive nature, whose poetry he could reproduce with lively fancy, and such a characteristic anarchy regulated by customs, and marked by all the unruly freedom of the individual, which was in such contrast to the police-ridden uniformity of other European countries. And since he was, not like Rzewuski, merely a gifted narrator who presented a past in careless fragmentary prose, but a writer who embalmed his recollections, observations, visions, and hopes in a form of entrancing melody, so that no syllable could be taken away from any line without loss, he endowed his chief work with such a power of resistance to time that it will come to later generations in Poland as the great diamond in the national patrimony, the cutting of which has made its value incalculable, and whose hard surface resists all attack. It is very suggestive that the contemporaries of Mickiewicz paid particular attention to the descriptions of the past in Pantadeusz. They considered the poem in connection with the recollections of Soplica, and thus, in the period which immediately followed, that one of the elements of the Polish Romanticists became the predominant one, which in the beginning had not been specially prominent, namely the element of the ancient nobility. In the track of Pantadeusz, the epopees and romances of the ancient nobility grew so rapidly that even Słowacki, in Agamemnon's Tomb, was obliged to utter a warning against this continual poison of the past, this Nessus-like shirt which the new Poland wore, the red contush and golden girdle of the old Szlachta. Now we can hardly comprehend that it was that in Pantadeusz which suggests Walter Scott, which about 1840 gave this unique poetical work its chief effect. At the present time it is clear that the reason that Mickiewicz, and he alone of the three great poets, finally succeeded in producing a work at once popular and imperishable, was the circumstance that he, and he alone, gave a description of realities with no fantastic or mystical elements interwoven, and painted a world which did not lie half hidden behind the mists of the past, but one which he himself had seen with the clear, wise eyes of childhood before it vanished. The subtitle of the poem is "The Last Raid in Lithuania," and treats of the old anarchical custom of determining litigation between two noble families thus: one of them, with its adherents in a body, simply rode out and took possession by force of the object in dispute. Thus it happens here. Between the families Soplica and Horeszko there is an old quarrel about the possession of a ruined castle. The nobility of the district is assembled at Soplicovo to settle the quarrel. There we become acquainted with all the persons who appear. The leading character, Tadeusz, his uncle, the Judge Soplica, the opposing party, the foolish Italianate, romantic Count Horeszko, in whom the author seems to have given the portrait of the man who supplanted him in the heart of Marylka, a handsome and amiable coquette from St. Petersburg, who is no longer young, Telimene, the young ingenue, Sophia of the house of Horeszko, who was brought up in the family of the judge, a young girl who has some of the traits of Marylka, finally a swarm of excellently drawn guests. They go on a bear hunt in the primeval forest, which is described with incomparable power. The hunters come into peril of their lives, but the bear is struck down by Robak, a mystic Bernardine monk, who intervenes on all occasions to help and rescue. The dispute about the bear's head excites Count Horeszko and leads him on to take forcible possession by raid of the castle adjudged to Soplica. This triumph is celebrated by a drinking bout, in which all the participants become so intoxicated that the Russian soldiers passing by are able to overcome them like beasts and bind them. But against the Russians all the Poles feel as if they were allies. Robak forms a plan to liberate the prisoners and take the Russians by surprise. It comes to a battle, in which indeed he is mortally wounded, but the Poles prevail. Their leaders must now, it is true, escape further pursued by flight, but they cross the Niemen to the troops of Napoleon, and soon return as officers in the Polish army under Dąbrowski, whose banner unites all the former opponents. The marriage of Tadeusz Soplica with Sofia Horeszko is celebrated as a symbol of the reconciliation of the rival houses, and at a great banquet Jankiel plays the history of Poland down to 1812, until all ends as in a golden dawn of bright hopes.
The leading character, Tadeusz, is an amiable and brave young fellow, not more interesting than one of Walter Scott's young heroes, and has no other function than that of holding the story together. His youthful nature is fully described, without hypocrisy or dissimulation. Nevertheless, there is nothing in him which fascinates. The real hero is not Tadeusz, but his father Jacek, who conceals his name and his rank under the cowl of the monk Robak. Jacek has formerly killed Sofia's father, the magnate Horeszko, just as he was defending his castle against the Russians. It is true that the great lord had rejected Jacek as a suitor, much as Count Ankwicz, from whom he is painted, had turned away Mickiewicz. Jacek never sees the daughter Eva again, the very name is preserved, and she is forced into the marriage in which Sofia is born. He himself marries afterwards without love, and becomes the father of Tadeusz. Thus penance for the murder of Horeszko as a Bernardine monk has Sofia educated, and watches over her and his son like a providence. As the murderer of Horeszko, he acquires the reputation of having been a tool of the Russians. In reality he is one of the trusted men of the French government, and has been entrusted with the task of arranging a great Polish insurrection. When he dies in the victorious battle with the Russians, the cross of the Legion of Honor is placed on his grave. In Jacek's personality we see, as it were, Mickiewicz's new poetry grow out of the older. As a murderer through injured pride, as the patient monk who pays for the untamed wildness of a moment by the renunciation of a lifetime, he reminds us of the old Byronic heroes, in his nature closely related to all the romantic and passionate characters of Mickiewicz. In certain ways he is as true a reflection of the personal life, experiences and sentiments of the author as Gustav and Conrad, but out of the lyrico-romantic kernel of his spiritual life the whole epic wealth bursts forth as a mighty oak grows from an acorn. The fate of the individual man is entirely absorbed in that of the whole nation, whose vices and virtues are unfolded to the reader, as we become acquainted with its quarrelsomeness, party dissensions, and inclinations to civil war, but also the enthusiasm which makes it ready, as soon as the blast from Europe reaches it, to rise as one man and realize its ideal. The blind hatred of the earlier poetry has vanished here. Płód, the born Pole, is put to shame and removed without mercy as a deserter. On the other hand, the Russian Rykov is a brave and honest fellow, a little inclined to drunkenness, like the Poles themselves, but incorruptible and good-natured. In the main, the description of individuals is not at all the most important thing here. The principal subject is the broad description of natural life and of human life as determined by natural surroundings. In the description of the bear hunt there is a passage where the Wojski, a title of honor, tribune, of the district, when the bear is killed, plays a flourish on his horn over the dead bruin. It is as follows: Then our Wojski grasped his horn, which was tied securely to his belt, his buffalo horn, long, with many windings, like a boa, carried it to his mouth with both hands. His cheeks are stretched like a pumpkin, bloodshot, his eyes burn. Now he drops his eyelids, then draws in his paunch, and draws breath and wind into his chest with all his might, and blows, like a storm blast whirls the roar away into the deep thicket, where echo plays with it. Then the huntsmen are dumb with astonishment, fascinated by the melody, purity, force, and fullness of the strong tones. All the art which formerly won him honor, now as an old man he displays once more in the assembly of the huntsmen. He soon wakes the oaks, fills the woods round about, as if he were beginning a hunt, as if the hounds were baying around. For it was the hunt,
painted in tones strong, clear. First it sounds aloud into the world, the fanfare of the morning signal. Then whines and howls, the sounds of a pack of hounds. Then it thunders now and then. It is the booming of the guns when they fire. Here he stopped, yet he did not drop the horn. They believed he was still playing, but it was the echo. He blew again, and the horn was as if enchanted, now harsh, now delicate, holy as the mouth of the Wojski treated it. He imitates the voices of the animals, just like a wolf's mouth. The horn now howls so hideously that all hearts fail. It opens like the throat of a bear, and sends out a loud roar. Suddenly, like the roar of the wild ox, they feel it rend the air. Here he stopped, yet the horn did not drop. They believed he was still playing, but it was the echo. For the trees repeated the matchless work of art, and it resounded from beech to beech, from oak to oak. He blew again, as if there were hundreds of horns in his horn, so the wild chase through the grain of the peasant is heard. Shots, baying of hounds, the death rattle of the deer. Now he raises the mouth of the horn, and the triumphal fanfare strikes with power against the vault of heaven. Here he stopped, but the horn did not drop. They believed he was still playing, but it was the echo. There sounded as many horns as there are trees in the forest, as from choir to choir it sped from tree to tree, and tones rolling wider follow on tones. Then they become softer, purer, and more tender, till they die away softly somewhere on the threshold of heaven. What is said here about the playing of the Wojski expresses exactly what Mickiewicz had the power to do, because he, the exile, dreamed himself back to his childish impressions of nature and human life in a land which lay in a naive and motley civilization, outside of trade, but with a characteristic stamp of handicraft, outside of a state of police, but with a recognized anarchy of established custom. He succeeded in making the ancient old Lithuanian forest speak, was able to conjure up the wild and merry hunt in the country, the natural sounds of the animals, the twitter of the birds, the growling of the bears, the bellow of the wild ox, the choir of all the human voices. He rises from the quiet whispering between beech and beech, oak and oak, until it is as if he had the melody of hundreds of horns in his horn, as if he had the voices of all the deceased generations of the land therein. These voices are heard through the poem ever in broader flood, ever in purer tone, giving utterance to the yearnings of the country in love and pain, hope and anger, wildness and folly, mirth and enthusiasm, until it appears as if the whole heaven of Poland were filled by this song. And when we have seen how deeply this poem of his even to this day affects the minds of the Poles, we are reminded of the words about the listeners to the Wojski, that it seemed to them that he was still playing when he had long ceased. So completely does Mickiewicz live in the echo he has evoked. End of section 32.
Section 33 of Poland, A Study of the Land, People, and Literature, by George Brandis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Piotr Nater. Division among the poets. Disorganization of Romanticism. Polish literature of today. Critical summary. Not one of the three great Romantic poets sang for long. Mickiewicz did not publish any more poems after 1840, though he lived 13 years longer, and Słowacki, who died in 1849, when only 37, wrote almost nothing in the last 3 years of his life. Rivalry and difference of opinion separated them widely in the 40s. The rupture between Mickiewicz and Słowacki was most complete. Słowacki's ill fortune and his irritable nature, as well as a somewhat unjustifiable coldness on the part of Mickiewicz, had constantly kept the former at a distance from his more fortunate rival in the admiration of his countrymen. Nevertheless, there was a moment when they met in unison. Some days after the Slav lectures by Mickiewicz at the College of France had been begun, during the Christmas of 1840, the Polish emigrants in Paris arranged a dinner for him,
At this festivity Słowacki was also present. Pan Tadeusz had made him forget all his earlier injuries and all his old rancor. He even rose, and in improvised verse celebrated the guest of honor as the first singer of their common fatherland. The best of his spiritual life broke through here. He sacrificed none of his dignity. There was a touch of bitterness in the way in which he alluded to his own fate, and a melancholy pride in the hope he expressed that he also in his way had rendered services his fatherland would value. But he addressed Mickiewicz with heartiness, and gave him his homage with sincere warmth. He declaimed his improvisation with so much enthusiasm that he won universal applause, except from some fanatical admirers of Mickiewicz who were instantly offended at his comparing his talent and fate with that of the great man. Mickiewicz gave a comparatively friendly answer, also in verse, probably the last verses he ever composed. There was some severity in his criticism of Słowacki's works and character. He advised him to control his pride and spirit, but he also said flattering things to him and mentioned that he himself in his day at Vilna had prophesied to Słowacki's mother the coming honor of her son. The two poets embraced each other, the bystanders embraced them with tears in their eyes, and the old enmity seemed to be a thing of the past. But soon after a final breach was brought about by a trifling cause, a silver bowl which Słowacki was asked to present to Mickiewicz in memory of this festival. Słowacki regarded this request as an insult, an imputation of vassalage, and when he refused, the new Catholic journals of the emigrants fell upon him and attacked his best poems and those of his friend Krasiński. He responded by attacking the blind admirers of Mickiewicz and described their conduct towards him and his friends, after which the papers gave erroneous accounts of what had happened at the festival between the two improvisators. Słowacki expected that Mickiewicz would now give an account of the actual occurrence, but when he wrapped himself up in dignified silence, exasperation took such hold upon Słowacki that it inspired him. He published Beniowski, a poem in the style of Byron's Don Juan and Musset's Namuna, in which the material was only a pretext for lyrical and emotional or scornful and pugnacious digressions from the main subject. And here he attacked Mickiewicz's adherents, the Jesuits of the emigrants, as he called them, scourged them with passion and wit, and settled his relation to Mickiewicz, made a brief abstract of his improvisations, and in conclusion threw at him this challenge: "We are two gods, each of whom rules upon his own son. I will not go with you on your wild path, but by quite another path, my own, and the people will follow me." At this point in Słowacki's literary life, Krasiński came publicly to his aid. In a somewhat lengthy article, the anonymity of which deceived no one, he sought to adjudicate between Mickiewicz and him, attributing to each his great qualities, and to each his own sphere. He attributes to Mickiewicz centripetal, to Słowacki centrifugal force, to the former plastic talent, and to the latter musical, laying stress on Słowacki's extraordinary control of language. With some inordinate and diffuse comparisons, he finally characterizes Mickiewicz as the Michelangelo of form, while Słowacki, he says, corresponds to Correggio and Raphael, or to Beethoven. The intention, at least, was good enough, and from that time the reputation of Słowacki was on the rise. Thus the faith was justified, which led Słowacki in his time to symbolize his relation to Krasiński by that of the twin brothers, Lel and Polel, who, bound together with an iron chain, constitute, as it were, one single person in the contest, the one wielding the sword, the other the shield. But soon this bond, apparently so strong, was to break. In the first half of the 40s, political life among the Polish emigrants had reached its apogee. They had an instinct that a general European outburst of revolutionary passion was imminent, and they gladly anticipated its coming in the belief that an insurrection was the only means of restoring Poland. Towiański's sect had created a mental ferment, but the most effective group among the emigrants was the Democratic Society, which had its seat first at Poitiers and afterwards at Versailles. It arranged a general revolt, which was to begin in Austrian and Prussian Poland, and since it justly contended that a revolt could not succeed without the help of the peasants, it addressed itself through secret messengers and pamphlets to the common people. In order to win them, it suggested a new partition of the soil, thus raised a threat against the landed proprietors. Pamphlets, the most important of which were signed with the pseudonym Prawdowski, carried on the revolutionary propaganda by declamations against the part which the aristocracy and clergy had played in the history of Poland. His dread of free thinking and his aversion to demagogues and socialists led Krasiński, in 1845, under the pseudonym Spiridon Prawdzicki, to write against Prawdowski's 3 psalms of faith, hope, and charity, fascinating in their verbal diction, but mystical in their preaching of prayer and moral self-purification as the only permissible means of contending with oppression, unjustly aggressive in their conception of the democrats as bloodhounds. Although he was so full of faith personally in the superior virtues, heroism, chivalry, etc., of the nobility, he did not deny their past sins, but appealed to the men who, with childlike cruelty, shouted for their blood, to throw away the knife. These psalms so greatly irritated Słowacki that he allowed himself to be drawn into a poetic answer to the author of the 3 psalms. With warmth and force, but also with bitter scorn, he refutes the doctrine of the right and use of passive resistance, and scoffs at Krasiński as the distinguished son of the nobility, who, tender of the welfare of the privileged class, sees dangers everywhere for the poor nobleman. Who has threatened you with the knife? Perhaps the light has penetrated through the red curtains of your windows. It has seemed to you to look like blood, and you shout, "Do not murder the Szlachta." I am humble enough not to curse any intellectual movement. Moreover, do not believe that the divine idea only unfolds itself under the direction of angels. God often allows it to be born in blood, and he sometimes sends it with Mongols. Against Słowacki's wish and design, this poem was published. The horrors of Galicia, which broke out immediately after, came as if to give the lie to Słowacki. Under the guidance of Austrian agents and liberated galley slaves, like that Szela who caused the whole family of Bohusz, 22 persons, to be put to death in 1846, 8,000 Polish soldiers, to whom Ferlau had been given, persuaded the peasants in Galicia to believe that the Tsar had emancipated them, but that the nobility prevented their exemption from service in the army, and a new partition of the land. They rose up as one man against their lords in the 3 bloody days, which have been already spoken of. Although it was not the democrats of Poland, but distinguished members of the Austrian government who were behind these murders, still they showed how easy it was to turn the Polish peasants into madmen. Krasiński's prophetic soul was justified, and in the year 1848 he responded to Słowacki's poem with the Psalm of Sadness. It is true that a superficial reconciliation between the 2 former friends was brought about, but still their last literary relation to each other was marked by jarring discord. In Słowacki's posthumous play The Incorrigibles, Krasiński is caricatured as Count Fantasius Dafnicki, who sets out to marry a fortune. Nay, even his enamorata, Delphine Potocka, is caricatured as the divorced Countess Idalia, who accompanies him everywhere. And in Krasiński's great posthumous work, The Unfinished Poem, in the suite of the demagogue Pankratius, Słowacki appears under the name of Juliusz as the popular prophet, who introduces himself with the outburst, "I am a great man, a prophetic spirit, place, place," proclaiming with unhealthy enthusiasm his contempt for Christianity and that indifference for human life which was expressed in his Król Duch. In 1848 Słowacki laid before his countrymen in Paris his plan for an insurrectionary league among the Poles. He went to Posen to induce the National Committee there to adopt it, to take part in the contest. But the revolt was then near its end. The battles of the 29th of April and the 2nd of May prepared the Poles for final defeat. After having seen his mother once more at Breslau, Słowacki turned back to Paris, and died the year after of a tedious and painful illness. In the great revolutionary year 1848 the Polish emigration had played out its part. Although national movements and efforts in this year had been so vigorous, not a single new state arose on a national foundation, nay, states, like Austria, which the carrying out of the principle of nationality would have shattered, came out of this crisis more powerful than ever. But so far as the Poles are concerned, this made little impression. The romantic ideals, whose central point was the speedy regeneration of the kingdom, still controlled the minds of all, though after the great poets became silent, Romanticism could no longer take so high a flight. The terrible collapse of 1863 was the first decisive thing which awakened the people out of their dream life and showed them the reality as it was. From this point in the literature of Poland, history and historical criticism have driven poetry into the background. In opposition to the old ideals and watchwords, a new ideal has arisen, that of the historic truth, and a new watchword, labour, and the most eminent writer and poet of the next succeeding age was the man who has most energetically extolled the importance of labour for his nation, and who has himself set an example in taking his task in literature as that of a workman on a grandest scale. Joseph Ignatius Kraszewski, 1812 to 1886, who in 1879, on his jubilee as an author, was visited by delegates from all quarters of Poland with gifts and letters of honorary citizenship as the greatest living national author of Poland, had at that time published 440 volumes, without collaborators, and if articles scattered here and there are included, perhaps 600 volumes in all. As a writer of romances, he prevented the higher classes from forgetting their nationality by exclusive reading of foreign books, and taught the nation to know itself, insomuch as he assailed the national delusions alternately in journalistic and poetic form, and as an energetic educator of the people showed the Poles what duties their political misfortunes had laid upon them in a higher degree than upon other nations. Kraszewski wrote historical romances, modern novels, fables, recollections, poems, comedies, books of travel, published popular books, and books for the young of ethnographical, archaeological, historical, and philosophical import, was a theatrical director, editor of a daily paper, and a political writer, as well as an illustrator, designer, and etcher. In brief, this one man distributed writings like a Bible society, and strove in these writings to form a national school for his people. It goes without saying that such fecundity was not combined with that artistic perfection which was the glory of the romantic poems. Nevertheless, romances like Morituri and Resurrecturi, novels like Ulana, and above all the extremely interesting Poter Jermola are works of real value. At the present time Poland has no author of the first rank, although it does not lack eminent talent in different directions. In Adam Asnyk Poland has a graceful lyric poet. In Bolesław Prus, Aleksander Głowacki, a humorous and sensitive novelist. This last author, a self-taught writer, a bold and truth-loving journalist, is one of the men whose influence is most important, and who will prove most instrumental in forming the new times in Poland. Asnyk was born at Kalisz in 1836, the son of a father who had been a captain in the disbanded Polish army. From his 19th year he studied medicine at the academy at Warsaw, and later at the universities of Breslau and Heidelberg, and returned in 1860 to the capital in order to lend his aid to the organization of the secret military force, which the young people in their resentment and heat intended to direct against the Russian power. He then took his share in the arrangements for the revolution of 1863, a movement which remains a monument alike to the heroism and the lack of political judgment of its promoters. He had already been arrested in 1860 and placed under police surveillance. He then went to Heidelberg and stayed there until the outbreak of the revolt recalled him and other Poles studying at foreign universities to Warsaw. He displayed such vigour and determination that although only 25 years old, he was placed at the head of the movement and elected a member of the secret national government which, under that gentle and loyal hero Mieczysław Sicicki, issued secret orders which were obeyed by all Poles, while the commands of the imperial authorities became dead letters. After the definitive triumph of the Russians, Sieczycki would not leave Warsaw. He was accordingly sent on foot to Siberia, where he remained 20 years. Asnyk fled to Austrian Poland, where he settled, first at Lemberg for a short time, then at Cracow, where every friend of Poland was sure of a welcome at his house. He travelled to Switzerland, Holland, England and Italy, and he has written on subjects suggested by these travels. But his spiritual life has been dominated entirely by the impression left on it by the failure of the revolt of 1863, namely, that all hope of an independent Poland must be abandoned, at least during his lifetime. He lost all faith in historical progress. The anguish he had gone through determined his manner of feeling for the rest of his life, his constant pessimism, his melancholy and doubt. Never again has he seen Russian Poland. But far from charging the calamities upon the comrades of his youth, as many others have done, he continued to communicate with them, with Sieczycki, with Karol Benny, with all who still frequent Benny's house in Warsaw. They always hold their patriotic but politically innocent meetings there. He published his poems, a selection of which appeared in a mediocre German translation under the pseudonym Eli, and took an active part in the public life of Galicia. He became a prominent member of the Democratic Party, and, from a sense of duty and without any pleasure in his task, editor of a great political paper, finally founding the Society of Public Schools, the efforts of which have been marked by such constant success. In addition, there are two men of very great ability, both a little over 40 years of age, who are the most important representatives of light literature. Aleksander Świętochowski is of noble birth but without the aristocratic stamp, the man of modern times, the fundamental spokesman of free thought, the representative of the advanced culture of Europe, of strong will and character, possessing a vigorous style and strong in argument, as an author wholly identifying himself with his principles. His dramas are without artistic value, but his novels, Chava Rubin, Damian Capenko, Karol Krug, apart from their moral endeavour to teach the Poles humanity towards foreigners on the soil of Poland, the Jewess, the Little Russian, the German, have a compact and concentrated form of high artistic merit. The novel Klemens Boruta develops the drama of starvation with poetic force. Henryk Sienkiewicz, Poland's favourite author, presents a sharp contrast to the untiring agitator Świętochowski. He has a patrician nature, with a rich and versatile talent, at once emotional and bitterly satirical. He has reached his highest point, and shown himself a keen realist in the spiritual domain in his charcoal drawings, Szkice węglem, the affectionate story of how a poor young peasant wife is driven to sell herself in order to free her husband from military service. A masterpiece. He is excellent in the very short story, The Lighthouse, The Angel, picturesque in representation and full of glowing intensity. I am sorry to say that of late years he has been absorbed in the production of endless historical novels in the style of the elder Dumas, which have made his name widely popular and produce a large income. And yet Pan Tadeusz had already pointed out to later poetry the way towards real life, the peculiar life of the century, and in fact inaugurated the epoch of Polish realism. It cannot be long before the conviction makes its way that if the authors of Poland of our time would compete with the best authors of Europe, with those like the great prose writers of France and Russia, it is absolutely necessary that they should turn their backs on the distant past and limit themselves to the one domain where it is possible for the authors wholly to escape convention, and to be not only inspired but true. It is only natural that the fancy of Polish writers should have, to an extent unprecedented elsewhere, continued to revolve about the past. Since the Polish people, as a people, has been condemned to practical inactivity, the past must appear to them as their last most glorious possession, and so, even after the decline of genuine Romanticism, Polish poets long continued to dwell on the memories of the past, which they found in books. instead of reproducing a life fully as interesting which flowed unheeded past them. The strong artistic impulse towards the past, nevertheless, depends in the last instance on the superstition that the past, or, as it is called, history, alone admits a representation of the ideal. But perhaps we shall see that the historical is as negligible in poetry as the spiritualistic. In the flourishing age of Polish Romanticism, nothing could be told or represented dramatically in which spirits did not play a part, frequently a chief part. They seemed more poetic and more ideal than men of flesh and blood. They took the place of the gods in the ancient poems, even intruded in contemporary subjects as in Dziady, and in historical drama as in Słowacki's Cięci. The conjuring up of the figures of the remote past in Polish romantic literature may be a new and only a slightly less abstract spiritualism, for these also may often be classified as good and evil spirits.
There is only one future for Poland's literature after its days of Romanticism are over, and that is to become a modern, a living expression of the life of our own time. The whole intellectual life, the whole literary world of Poland, for a long time turned upon the question of its existence. We have seen that this question developed into the question of the reality of the loftiest ideas. But it goes without saying that the literature of a people cannot everlastingly continue to turn upon so abstract a theme. The fundamental emotion, to which the romantic literature of Poland gave expression, is not likely to disappear, but it cannot continue to be predominant without impoverishing her literature. The two predominant sensations of feelings of cohesion, of common sufferings and common exertions, the continual playing on a single string, must prevent individuals from coming forward in literature in all their originality, because they are continually regarded as a link in a whole, sharing pleasures and disappointments with others. They do not reach the depth of the agony of existence. They are not represented as solitary enough. If it is an evil not to see the wood for the trees, then it is also an evil not to see the trees for the wood. No doubt we find here in the youthful works of the poets enough of the half-assumed sensation of loneliness of the Byronic heroes. But the loneliness of the uncomplaining man obtains no expression. It is in consonance with this that the characters in this literature, in spite of all the hardships and evils which shower down upon them from without, are not unhappy enough. The misfortunes whose stage is the outer world are found here in abundance. But the greatest tragedy, that of which the human soul may be the theatre, even without any special pursuit of a hostile fate, is not presented to the reader's consciousness in the same degree. These poets have so naturally felt impelled to say a consoling, hopeful word to their readers, that they have not sounded misery to the lowest depth with their imaginative power. And on the other side, the romantic literary group of Poland, rich as it is, has this defect that it has allowed very little scope to the comic elements of existence. Thus it lacks a full grasp of human life, its whole intensity. It seems as if the sense of the comic were not very strong or very widespread among the Polish people. The poets, who, like Fredro, have had a sharp eye for it, have not used their talent for the comic in the service of the more elevated ideas, and the poets who, like the Romanticists, have laboured in the name of ideas, have shown little skill in the use of laughter, either as a weapon or as the expression of cheerfulness. There is a gleam of humour diffused throughout Pantadeusz, which could not be more delicately beautiful, but it is weak, and the poet has not succeeded in making a really comic impression when he intends to. Thus the Count now and then becomes tedious when he ought to be comic. With a better developed sense of humour, Mickiewicz again would not have produced a figure like Gustav in Dziady. He is unintentionally comic when he ought to be most impressive. Neither does Słowacki ever achieve a strong comic effect. His comic secondary characters are never observed from real life, but constantly remind us either of a Shakespearean clown or of a Calderonian gracioso, and at best create a smile, never laughter. He really produces a comic effect only when he does not intend to,
as in depicting the achievements of his sottish and desperate hero Lambro. Finally, however alien comic effects are to a talent like Krasiński's, still the drawing of the character of the Italian baron in the unfinished poem shows that he possessed undeveloped ability in that direction. It is a pity that he did not in the least feel the impulse to use it. There would have been a fine scope for comic effects in the godless comedy. Pancratius and his associates would have gained thereby. Generally speaking, it may be said that a more widely diffused and more delicate sense of the comic among the leading persons of the nation would have prevented several of the excesses of the romantic heroes, driven the romantic ghosts and witches more into the background, and sharpened the delineation of a crowd of secondary characters. The lack of the comic element in this literature has a triple reason. First, the serious, nay, melancholy temper of the public for whom the poets wrote. Secondly, their strenuous conception of their calling, for they regarded themselves as the teachers and leaders of the people, never as their maîtres de plaisir. Finally, the exaggerated idealism of the Polish intellectual life of this century. This idealism, which naturally has engendered no little boldness in expressing an unwelcome conviction or a burning protest, excluded the bold and many-sided conception and description of human nature. Polish Romanticism lacks the strong contrasts which produce the impression of the comic, because it has represented man too exclusively from the intellectual side. That man is first and foremost a being with necessities, not a being with ideas, is here suppressed or glossed over. That strong erotic or political passion is an exception in human life, we note as little in this romantic literature as in others. But there is perhaps no literature in which the life of the senses and instincts, which is the foundation of all passions, is so set aside, or, where it could not be wholly passed over, is so foreshortened and placed in the background. Therefore we shall seek in vain for more sexless love-making than that which is described in the romantic literature of Poland, in Słowacki's In Switzerland, in Krasiński's Aurora, etc. We are actually astonished at the note and the key which Telimene puts into the hand of the hero in Pantadeusz, and yet this is all that we learn of the relation between the two. But where the whole sensual entity of man, and therewith one of the strongest elements of contrast between spiritual struggles and earthly instincts, is omitted in the picture, there the tragic hemisphere in poetry must necessarily lack the supplement which the comic hemisphere supplies. Perhaps, nevertheless, what is most wanting in this epoch of Polish literature is, as was to be expected, the expression of the peaceful pleasures of life. It contains much love, but no contentment. It is a great exception when a character appears who now and then breathes fully and freely. Still, what this epoch possesses is rich and abundant, an earnestness so great that no other literature in Europe is so intensely earnest, a pathos so deep that only the greatest tragic authors of Greece and England speak in such a strain, and an enthusiasm so lofty and pure that it is only occasionally manifested in other countries. Nowhere else do we see a whole generation carried away as here by it. As a form of art, Romanticism is dead, a thing of the past. Its heroes and heroines, its spirits and witches, in part even its language and style, are antiquated. Nevertheless, there is a Romanticism which outlives forms of art and schools of art, and which still preserves its vitality and worth. It is the element of healthy enthusiasm which every strong human emotion can assume when it is refined and intensified beyond the average, without any background whatsoever of superstition, and without relation to anything supernatural. Our feelings for nature, for the woods and fields, the sea and the heavens, may assume this form of romantic ecstasy, and in even higher degree emotions like love, friendship, love between parents and children, love of language and native land, and common memories may take a like form. In few literatures has this abiding romanticism attained to an expression of such beauty as in the Polish. End of section 33.
Section 34 of Poland, A Study of the Land, People, and Literature, by George Brandis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Piotr Nater. Conclusion. Passing through the side wing of the great Kremlin Palace at Moscow, which contains the armory, Oruszenaya Palata, we see, in the lower story, 22 marble busts of Polish kings and distinguished Poles. In the story above, in the large round hall, the Polish throne, and nearby the crown worn by the last king of Poland, Stanislaus Augustus, and finally, in the adjoining room, opposite Charles XII's sedan chair taken at the battle at Poltava, 60 Polish banners, captured from 1831 to 1863, with Polish inscriptions, torn by bullets, and to the right of these, on the floor, a beautifully made closed casket. In this casket is deposited the Constitution of the 3rd of May 1791. Poland's patent of nobility among the people of Europe has become an object in a museum. A Russian who accompanied me to the Kremlin, in spite of his nationality, made the remark, "It makes a melancholy impression to see the banners and the casket here. How strange it must be for a Pole, with any national feeling, to see the great men of his country, the insignia, which were the symbols of the dignity of his fatherland as an independent power, its ensigns with the white eagle, nay, even the Magna Carta, which his people, in the most supreme moment of its life, formed for its future, and which was never rightfully displaced, exhibited here in the imperial palace of a foreign capital, as curiosities for the amusement of spectators. It must be like reading one's own name on a tombstone. To be fought against, to be persecuted, to be treated as a criminal, when you are in the right, may be borne, but to see yourself treated as dead, to see your memories, your pride, your banner, your charter exhibited to the scorn of another as his possessions, as trinkets found in a grave, that is to see with your own eyes, with your own hands to grasp, the complete destruction of that for which you live, and yet to go on living and believing in it. Again and again we return to the thought, how symbolical this Poland is. For in this period, what other lot than that of the Pole has everyone had, who has loved freedom and wished it well? What else has he experienced but defeat? When has he seen a gleam of sunlight? When has he heard a signal of advance? Everywhere, everywhere the fanfare of the violent, or the organ peal of the bold-faced hypocrite, and everywhere stupidity as bodyguard of the lie, and everywhere veneration for that which is paltry, and everywhere the same vulgar disdain for the only thing which is holy. Yes, Poland, thou art the great symbol, the symbol of pinioned freedom, whose neck is trodden upon, symbol of those who lack any outlook, yet hope against all probability, in spite of all. When the foreigner sees thee covered with thy mantle of snow in the winter time, then it seems to him as if the cold, and the snow, and the eternally gloomy heavens were so in harmony with thy being, that he can hardly imagine these bare trees covered with leaves, these streets and roads free from snow, these heavens pure and warm, this land without winter. But if he comes to Warsaw on a summer day, when the sun glimmers through the thick foliage in the Saxon Park, when the green square, Zielony Plac, deserves its name, and Łazienki lies smiling and elegant, bordered by its group of trees reflected in its park, then he feels that sunshine and the warmth of summer are also at home here. Wilanów allures him, Sobieski's beautiful country seat, which he has hitherto seen only in the light of a cold spring day, and he finds the palace surrounded by a luxuriant, fragrant flora, by tall trees, which Sobieski planted himself or caused to be planted. Never has he seen such tall, such magnificent poplars, tall as the cypresses in Hadrian's villa at Tivoli, proud like them, melancholy and yet solemn like them. And when, on a summer afternoon, the breezes sigh gently through the tall poplars at Wilanów, and the foreigner walks slowly through the broad avenue they form, while he hears the Polish language about him,
and perhaps sees dear beings beside him who live wholly and entirely in their passion for the cause of Poland, as the cause which gives a meaning and a consecration to their lives, and in faith in the future of Poland as the faith which alone has made them brave, useful men, then when the sunset is beautiful, and the flowers exhale their fragrance, and the temperature is mild, and the air a caress, the foreign wanderer feels less hopeless, and he says to himself, "Who knows? Perhaps, in spite of all."
End of conclusion. End of Poland, a study of the land, people, and literature, by George Brandes.